We're drifting slowly into the timeline of Resident Evil, into the long, cold history of a dream that thought it could purchase forever and paid for it in the ruin of the living. It is a story of a pale flower and the men who worshipped it, of a corporation that wore the mask of mercy while it counted its dead, of families broken and remade in laboratories where no window ever opened. Born in the deep places of the earth, beneath a mountain in Africa, in caverns that had never known the sun, it began with something quiet and patient and ancient, something that could take a body apart and put it back together as something else. But beneath the promise of a cure, there was always the hunger. Beneath the talk of healing, there was the older dream, the dream of standing above the rest of us, untouched by age, untouched by death, untouched by the small mercies that make us human. This is the story of how a flower became a plague, and how a plague became an empire, and how an empire, feeding on the world, at last devoured itself. So settle now. Let the room grow soft around you. Let your eyes close, if they will, and drift with me, slowly, gently, down through the years, from the first pale bloom in the dark to the last whispering mold in a snowbound village at the edge of the world. We will walk this road together, one quiet era at a time, and we will not is long, and there is time enough in the cold hours to hear the whole of it. There is a particular hush over this history, the hush of places built to be forgotten, of files sealed and cities erased and names struck from every record. But nothing is ever truly erased. The echoes remain. They gather in the quiet, in the dark corners of the world, in the memory of those who survived, and they wait, as the flower waited, patient as stone, for someone to come looking. And we have come looking. So let us begin, as all of it began, far below the ground, where the sun has never fallen, and the first terrible promise was still only a bloom in the blackness. Born far beneath the earth, in the black caverns of West Africa, where no light had ever reached, there grew a flower. It was pale and quiet, and unremarkable to any passing eye. It swayed in the still air of the underground, in a silence older than any human word. It bloomed and it withered, and it bloomed again, patient as the stone around it. The Ndipaya people knew it, and they feared it, and they revered it. They called it a maker of kings, for the flower carried something inside its roots, something ancient, something that could unmake a body and make it anew. Most who tasted it simply died, dissolving into the dark from which the flower had come. But a rare few, a chosen few, survived and rose and ruled. And so the flower became a throne, and the throne became a legend, and the legend waited in the blackness for the day that ambition would come looking. Linger a moment with that flower, in the dark where it grew, for everything that came after was only its long shadow. Think of how patient it was, how quiet, blooming and withering in a night that had never known a single dawn. It asked for nothing. It hunted no one. It simply held, coiled in its roots, the oldest and most dangerous promise in the world, the promise that death itself might be persuaded to loosen its grip. The Ndipaya understood, in the way that older peoples often understood the things we have forgotten, that such a promise is never truly a gift, that a doorway leading past death must open on its other side onto something worse. And so they did not sell the flower, nor spread it, nor dream of empires built upon it. They guarded it. They wove it into their fears and their rights, and they kept it in the dark. And perhaps they hoped, in their quiet way, that the world above would never come looking. But the world always comes looking in the end. The world cannot leave a locked door alone, and far away, In the cold libraries of Europe, 3 young men were already dreaming of doorways, already whispering to one another of a better humanity, already reaching, without knowing it, toward the flower in the dark. That ambition wore 3 faces, 3 friends, 3 brilliant minds, 3 young men who believed the world could be remade in their image. Oswell E. Spencer, cold and elegant, a man of old blood and older hunger, the last aristocrat of a fading line, who looked at his fading fortune and decided he would build a new nobility with himself at its crown. James Marcus, secretive and strange, a scholar who loved knowledge more than he loved people, a man who could lose himself for days in the patient study of small crawling things, and Edward Ashford, the gentlest of the 3, loyal and quiet, the one who wanted, perhaps most sincerely, to heal. They came together in the middle of the 20th century, drawn by a shared conviction that humanity was unfinished, that it might be lifted out of its long suffering, that the right minds and the right science might push back the shadow of death for good. And when they heard the old stories, the rumors of a flower in Africa that made kings of men, they did not laugh. They went looking, and they found it. In the winter of 1966, deep beneath the Kijuju earth, they came into the presence of the pale bloom, and they took from it the thing sleeping in its roots, and they gave it a name that sounded like hope. They called it the Progenitor virus, and here we should pause and grieve a little for the men they might have been. For they were not born monsters, Spencer and Marcus and Ashford, no more than any of us are. They were young once, and brilliant, and full of the fierce bright hope of clever men who believe they can mend the broken places of the world. Perhaps they truly meant it in the beginning, the talk of curing sickness, of ending death, of lifting the whole species into something finer. We would like to believe there was a season, brief as a single spring, when the dream was still clean. But the flower does not care how a dream begins. It waits, patient as the stone, for the small worm of hunger that lives in every human heart to wake and stir and whisper. And of the 3, it was Spencer who listened soonest and closest and longest. That was all. That was enough. To hold a dream so large and so forbidden, the 3 friends knew they would need a fortress, a face to show the world, a name behind which their true work could be done in the dark. And so, in the spring of 1968, they founded a company. They called it the Umbrella Corporation, and they gave it a face of gentle mercy, a maker of medicines, a healer of the sick, a friend to every family in every home. Its logo was a red and white shield, a thing that promised shelter, protection, safety from the storm. And beneath that shield, in laboratories no customer would ever see, they poured the Progenitor virus into living things and watched what came back. It was Spencer's genius, this doubleness, this corporation that healed with one hand and harvested with the other. The medicines were real. The cures were real. The vast fortune that flowed in from an unsuspecting world was real, and it paid for everything, for the hidden facilities, for the private armies, for the long, patient work of turning a flower into a weapon. Umbrella grew and grew and grew until its shield hung over pharmacies and hospitals and research parks across the world, until governments courted it and soldiers served it, and no one thought to ask what its scientists did in the rooms with no windows. But beneath the growth, the old friendship was already curdling. Spencer had never truly meant to share. He watched Marcus retreat into his private studies, guarding his discoveries like a miser guards gold. He watched Edward Ashford sicken and weaken and die young, leaving behind a name and a son and a wound in the partnership that would never close. 3 had become 2, and the 2 did not trust each other, and the trust that remained was thin as frost on glass. And Spencer, cold and patient and certain, began already to plan for the day when he would stand alone at the summit of it all, the sole god of the new religion, the last king the flower would ever make. The corporation was his throne now. The world outside would go on believing in the shield, in the shelter, in the kindly medicine company that only ever wanted to help. And in the dark beneath the shield, the work went on. Deep in the Arklay Mountains, in the forests above a small American town called Raccoon City, Umbrella raised a house. It was a beautiful, terrible thing, all marble and shadow, a mansion of long halls and locked rooms and portraits that seemed to watch you as you passed. To any guest, it was the country estate of a wealthy company, elegant and remote. But the mansion was a lie told to hide a deeper truth. Beneath it, far beneath, Umbrella had dug its laboratories, tier upon tier of tiled corridors sinking down into the mountain's cold heart. And there, away from every prying eye, the real work of the corporation was done. The house was designed by a man named George Trevor, a gifted architect who filled it with puzzles and hidden passages at Spencer's own request, never guessing why a medicine company would want a home so full of secret doors. When his work was finished, Spencer could not let him leave to carry the mansion's secrets into the world. And so Trevor vanished into the very maze he had built, and his wife and his daughter were taken down into the labs below to become something the corporation needed more than it needed an architect. Picture the mansion in the winter dark, its windows glowing faintly against the black trees, and beneath it, far beneath, the long cold corridors where the work was done, the hum of machines, the drip of water, the pale green light over the specimen tanks, where things that had been animals and things that had been men floated in silence, half made, half unmade, waiting. There is a particular cold in a place like that, a cold that is not of the air but of the purpose, the cold of a place where living things have been reduced to questions, and the questions have no kindness in them. The scientists walked those corridors like priests through a temple, and perhaps that is how they thought of themselves, the first celebrants of a new religion, whose God was the flower, and whose scripture was written in the unspooling strands of life. And in one of the deepest cells, in the dark, a small experiment that had once been a little girl was beginning, slowly to become something that would not, could not die. Away from the mansion, higher in the mountains, in a hidden training facility of pipes and pumps and slow-dripping water, James Marcus bent over his own quiet obsession. He had come to love the small crawling things of the world, and above all, he loved his leeches. He truly did. He spoke to them, in the long empty hours, as a man speaks to children or to gods. He fed them and studied them, and let the young virus flow through them, and in his loneliness, he came to cherish the mindless, patient creatures more than he had ever cherished any person. There was a grief in it, perhaps, a man so brilliant and so alone that only his monsters would keep him company. And there was hubris in it too, the belief that he, and he alone, understood the flower's true meaning, that Spencer was a thief and a lesser man, that the virus was his discovery, his triumph, his alone to keep. For Marcus had made the great breakthrough. He had learned that raw Progenitor was too proud, too deadly, too quick to burn out the bodies it touched. It killed too well and spread too poorly. And a plague that cannot spread is no plague at all, only a private death. So Marcus went looking for a partner for the pale flower, something wild and hungry, something that already knew how to slip from body to body in the dark. He found it in the blood of a leech, in the strange resilience of a creature that could be cut and yet live. And he wove the leech together with the progenitor, strand by strand, and the flower learned a terrible new patience. He called the result the tyrant virus, the T-virus, and with it, everything would change. Marcus knew what he had made. He knew it was the most important thing any of them had ever done. The true child of the flower, the seed of every horror that would follow. And he grew jealous of it, and secretive, and strange, retreating deeper into his mountain facility, into the company of his beloved leeches, guarding his discovery from the man he no longer trusted. He should have run. He should have taken his virus and vanished into some far corner of the world. But he could not leave his work, and he could not imagine that Spencer, his old friend, would do to him what he was already planning. That was the mistake that all the founders made. They believed their genius made them safe. Spencer thought otherwise. Spencer always thought otherwise. He looked at Marcus, brilliant and jealous, in his mountain laboratory, and he saw not a friend, but an obstacle, a man who guarded the very thing Spencer needed most. And so, in the summer of 1988, on Spencer's quiet order, 2 of Marcus's own students came to him in the dark of his facility, and they shot him, and they threw his cooling body into a pool of stagnant water to be forgotten. The 2 students were young and gifted and cold in a way that pleased Spencer greatly. One was named William Birkin. The other was named Albert Wesker. They took Marcus's research, his precious T-virus, his years of patient love poured out into the leeches, and they carried it back down the mountain to the corporation. And Marcus's name began slowly to fade from every record, as if he had never been. But the leeches did not forget. They found their master's body in the still water, and they wrapped themselves around it. And the T-virus that lived in them began, slowly, tenderly, terribly, to bring something back. Not a man. Not quite. Something that wore Marcus's face, and remembered Marcus's rage, and would rise from the water years later with vengeance, where its heart should have been. Perhaps that is what obsession truly buys us, in the end. Not immortality. Only the long, echoing memory of a wound, carried in the bodies of things that should have stayed asleep. For years, the thing that had been Marcus slept in the flooded dark, growing, dreaming, hating, becoming. It watched the world through the eyes of its leeches. It waited. And when at last it woke, it would not come as a man, but as a swarm, a single will scattered across 1,000 hungry bodies, wearing the shape of the friend that Spencer had murdered, coming home to collect a debt 10 years overdue. So the founding generation began to turn upon itself, friend killing friend, dream devouring dreamer, and the 2 young men who had done the killing rose in the ashes to take the work as their own. Birkin, brilliant and driven. Wesker, patient and ambitious beyond all measure. The flower had made its kings and unmade them, and now it turned to a new generation and offered them the same old poison, wearing the same old mask of hope. Return now to the deep cells beneath the Arclay mansion, to the oldest and saddest of all Umbrella's experiments, to a girl named Lisa Trevor. She was the daughter of George Trevor, the architect who had built the beautiful house above, and she had been taken with her mother when Spencer could not let the family carry his secrets away. That was in the 1960s, when Lisa was still a child, and for the decades that followed, in the dark beneath the mountain, the scientists used her. They fed her viruses one after another, Progenitor and its offspring, watching, always watching, to see what the flower would do to a living human body over the long, slow crawl of years. Most subjects died. Lisa did not. Something in her clung to life with a terrible, unbreakable strength, and the viruses, instead of killing her, made her over again and again into something no longer quite human and yet never released into death. She grew strong beyond reason. She grew twisted, and through all of it, through all the decades of pain, one small human thing survived in her, buried under the horror. She wanted her mother. She had watched her mother die long ago, and in her broken mind she could not accept it. And so she took the faces of the dead, peeling them away and wearing them, searching, always searching, for the face that would be her mother's, hunting a love that had been stolen from her before she ever understood what love was. There is no monster in all this long history more pitiable than Lisa Trevor. She hurt no one out of malice. She had no malice left. She was only a wound that would not close, a grief the corporation had made immortal, shuffling through the dark corridors of the place her own father had designed, calling for a mother who would never come. And here, in her, we see the true face of Umbrella's dream laid bare. Not glory, not healing, not even power. Only this: a child made deathless so that she could suffer forever, so that men in clean coats could learn a little more about the flower. Perhaps her soul cried out, in the long dark, to be allowed at last to rest. Perhaps that cry would one day be answered, but not yet, not for a long time yet. For now she waited, in the deep places, as the corporation above her ground on, and the years turned, and the day of reckoning drew slowly nearer. Of the three founders, Edward Ashford had died first and youngest, but his blood did not vanish from the story. It passed to his son, Alexander Ashford, a man who inherited his father's name and his father's place in Umbrella, but who lived always in the shadow of the corporation's true master, Spencer. For Spencer had used the years to erase the others, to gather the glory and the power to himself, and Alexander, watching his family's honor fade, burned with a quiet, desperate need to restore it. He was not the genius his father had been. He knew it, and so he reached for a shortcut, a project that would make the Ashford name great again, a scheme to breed the perfect being, a new founder built from the best of the old. He took the recovered genetic material of Veronica Ashford, the ancient and brilliant matriarch of the family line, and he set out to create children who would carry that greatness reborn. The result was a pair of twins, a boy and a girl, Alfred and Alexia Ashford, raised in cold isolation to be the saviors of the house. But the experiment did not stop there. Alexander, in his hunger, went further than any father should. When his great project reached its terrible climax, he offered up his own body to it and became a subject rather than a scientist, and was undone by the very greatness he had tried to seize. He did not die. He was made instead into a shambling, mindless thing, hidden away by his own children on a remote island. A secret shame kept breathing in the dark. Consider the sorrow of it. A man who wanted only to lift his family back into the light, who loved his name more than his own life, and who threw that life away chasing a glory that was never truly his to hold. The Ashford line, which had begun in Edward, the gentlest of the founders, curdled now into obsession and madness across the generations, each heir grasping for a greatness that slipped further from their fingers the harder they reached. And of the twins Alexander made, one would prove far more than a mere restoration of the family name. One of them carried something new, something the flower had never made before, something that would burn cold and bright and terrible when at last it woke. Of the Ashford twins, it was the girl, Alexia, who inherited the family's genius in full and terrible measure. She was a prodigy beyond her years, a mind so keen it frightened the scientists who tested her, and where her father Alexander had grasped clumsily at greatness, Alexia seized it with cold and perfect certainty. Deep in the Antarctic, in a hidden umbrella facility, she pursued her own strain of the flower's gift. She found, in the frozen wastes, in the blood of an ancient ant queen, a virus of her own, and she called it the T. veronica virus, after the ancestress whose greatness she meant to surpass. But Alexia understood something the others had rushed past. She saw that the virus, injected raw, would only devour the mind before it could perfect the body. And so she did the coldest, most patient thing in all this cold and patient history. She infected herself, and then she froze herself, sleeping in ice for 15 long years, so that the virus might spread through her slowly, gently, in perfect harmony with her sleeping flesh, until she could wake as something more than human, a queen worthy of the name Ashford. 15 years she slept in the ice, while the world turned, while Umbrella rose and began at last to fall, while her brother Alfred, left alone, unravelled slowly into madness, dressing in her clothes, speaking in her voice, keeping her memory alive in the empty halls until he could no longer tell where he ended and she began. There is a strange, doomed devotion in the twins, a love so total and so isolated that it became a kind of sickness all its own. Alfred worshipped his sleeping sister as a saint worships a god, and waited in the cold for the day she would wake and set the family's greatness ablaze at last. And when she did wake, when Alexia at last rose from her long sleep of ice, she would prove every bit the monster her ambition had promised. Cold as the Antarctic itself, beautiful and burning and utterly without mercy, the last and greatest of the Ashfords, remade by a flower of her own finding into something that no longer needed the human world at all. But her waking was still years away, for now she slept and dreamed her frozen dreams, and the story turned back toward Raccoon City and the 2 young men who had murdered Marcus, and the darker work that was ripening in the labs below. Of the 2 students who killed James Marcus, William Birkin was the true scientist, a prodigy who had risen through Umbrella so fast and so young that the corporation built a laboratory around him and let him chase his dreams without restraint. He inherited the T-virus, Marcus's stolen child, and he refined it and perfected it, and made himself indispensable to Spencer's empire. But William was not content to polish another man's flower. He wanted his own. And so, in the deep labs beneath Raccoon City, he began to reach for something beyond the T-virus, something greater and stranger and more terrible, a virus that would not merely reanimate the dead or twist the living, but would rewrite a human being into a new and unkillable form, evolving, adapting, growing past every wound. He called it the G-virus, G for God. William Birkin poured his life into that dream. He worked through the nights, in the pale light of the specimen tanks, while his young wife Annette worked beside him, and their small daughter Sherry grew up half forgotten in the shadow of the family's true child, the virus. For that is what the G-virus became to William, a second child, more beloved than the first, the thing into which he poured all his ambition and all his love. And perhaps that is the quiet tragedy at the heart of the Birkin family. A man so devoted to the making of a god that he could not spare the tenderness for the daughter who needed him. A little girl who wandered the edges of her parents' obsession, lonely in a house that had room only for the work. William grew paranoid as his masterpiece neared completion, for he knew the G-virus was the most valuable thing in the world, and he knew that Umbrella, the corporation he had served all his life, would take it from him the moment it was finished, and cast him aside as Spencer had cast aside Marcus. He had helped murder one man for the flower's sake. He understood, better than anyone, what the corporation did to those who held something it wanted. And so he made his own quiet plans to keep the G virus for himself, to run, if he had to betray Umbrella before Umbrella could betray him. He did not know that the corporation was already watching, already deciding, already sending its soldiers down into the dark to take by force the god he had made. And when they came, everything he had built and everything he loved would burn. The other student who killed James Marcus was Albert Wesker, and of all the figures in this long history, none was colder or more patient or more dangerous. For Wesker was not, in the ordinary sense, even a natural man. He was one of the children of Project W, a scheme of Spencer's own devising, in which gifted infants were gathered from across the world, given the Wesker name, and raised to be the superior beings who would one day inherit Spencer's new world order. Most of those children died. A handful survived. And of the survivors, Albert Wesker rose highest, sharpest, most ruthless of them all. A man engineered from the cradle to believe himself above the common run of humanity, and who came, in time, to believe it utterly. He served Umbrella, and he rose within it, and all the while he served only himself, watching, calculating, gathering every secret the corporation held, biding his time behind mirrored sunglasses and a voice as smooth and cold as glass. Wesker felt no loyalty to Umbrella, to Spencer, to any living soul. He had been made to feel none. He saw the whole vast machinery of the corporation, the viruses and the monsters and the empires of money, as tools, no more, instruments he would one day take up for his own ascension. For that was Wesker's true dream, older and simpler and more terrible than any corporate scheme. He wished to shed his humanity entirely, to become the next step, the superior being the flower had always promised, and to remake the world with himself as its god and its judge. Everything he did, every betrayal, every murder, every patient decade of scheming, bent toward that single coal star, and he had chosen already the moment of his rebirth. He had come into possession of a virus of his own, a gift from a rival within Umbrella, who wished to use him, a serum that would kill a man and then return him changed, faster and stronger and more than human. Wesker meant to take it. He meant to die and rise and leave the whole human world behind. But first, he needed a stage grand enough for the god he intended to become. He needed Umbrella to fall, and its secrets to spill into the light, and its monsters to be loosed upon the world. And in the mountains above Raccoon City, in a beautiful, terrible mansion full of locked doors, that stage was very nearly set. Before the fall, let us pause and look upon the empire in its full and terrible flower, for it will not stand much longer. By the middle of the 1990s, the Umbrella Corporation had grown into one of the largest and richest enterprises the world had ever known. Its shield hung over pharmacies in 100 nations. Its medicines filled the cabinets of ordinary homes. Its research parks and universities trained the brightest minds of a generation, and its charities fed the poor, and its name was spoken with trust and even gratitude across the globe. And all of it, every clean and kindly face of it, was a mask. Behind the medicines lay the bioweapons. Behind the charities lay the private armies. Behind the trust lay a corporation that had, by now, killed more people in secret than most wars, that tested its viruses on the unsuspecting, that raised whole towns and treated them as laboratories. that answered to no law and no God but Spencer's cold ambition. Umbrella had learned that a lie told large enough and told with a shield for its emblem would be believed by a whole world that did not wish to look too closely. And the money flowed and paid for everything, and the corporation swelled until it seemed it might never fall at all. But rot does not respect the size of the house it lives in. Beneath the empire's marble face, the corruption ran all the way to the foundations. The founders had turned upon each other. The scientists schemed against their masters. Wesker plotted his ascension, and Birkin guarded his god, and Spencer, aging now, sat alone at the summit of it all, trusting no one, loved by no one, a king who had gotten everything he ever wanted and found it cold as the flower in its cavern. The very things that had made Umbrella great, its secrecy, its cruelty, its perfect willingness to sacrifice anything and anyone, were the things that would bring it down. For a corporation built entirely on monsters cannot forever keep those monsters caged. Sooner or later, a door is left open. Sooner or later, the flower's children slip their leashes. And the first door to open, the first small crack through which the whole rotten empire would begin to bleed out, was in the labs beneath the beautiful mansion in the Arklay Mountains, where an accident or a betrayal, or perhaps both, was about to set the dead to walking. At the foot of the Arklay Mountains lay the town that Umbrella built, or as good as built, and its name was Raccoon City. It had begun as an ordinary place, a modest American town of quiet streets and family homes, a police station and a hospital, a church and a schoolyard and a diner where the coffee was always warm. But Umbrella had come, decades before, and Umbrella had never truly left. The corporation's money ran through the town like blood through a body. It funded the hospital and the university. It employed half the working people, directly or through 100 quiet subsidiaries. It sat on the town council in ways no one quite saw, and it owned the mayor, and it owned the newspapers, and it built, beneath the ordinary streets, a hidden world of laboratories and tunnels and secret ways, so that Raccoon City became, without ever knowing it, a single vast experiment, a place where the corporation could work in the open by keeping the town blind. The people of Raccoon City loved their home. They raised their children there. They did not know that beneath their feet, in the dark, the flower's children stirred. They did not know that their trusted benefactor kept monsters in cages under the hospital, that the water they drank had, in careful doses, been used to test the corporation's work, that the whole warm and ordinary life of the town was a fiction Umbrella maintained for as long as it served the corporation's purposes. And that is the deepest horror of Raccoon City, deeper than any monster in its sewers. Not that a plague would one day rise up and devour it, but that it had been marked for devouring all along, that its trust had been farmed like a crop, that its people had been kept comfortable and blind precisely so, that they might be spent, when the time came, without complaint. There is a particular sorrow in a doomed town that does not know it is doomed, in the ordinary evenings of ordinary people going about their small and precious lives above a darkness that has already, in some cold office, decided their fate. Raccoon City slept and worked and dreamed its small dreams, warm in the shadow of the mountain. And in the mansion above, and in the labs below, the last locks were quietly failing, and the long night of the town was about to begin. It began, as so many disasters do, with a small thing gone wrong in the dark. In the labs beneath the Arklay mansion, in the early summer of 1998, the T-virus escaped. How it escaped is a matter of shadows. Some say it was an accident, a broken vial, a failing seal in an old and overburdened facility. Others whisper that it was no accident at all, that it was Wesker's hand or another's that loosed the plague on purpose to spill Umbrella's secrets and set the great fall in motion. Perhaps it was both. Perhaps a careless mistake fell into a careful plan, and the two together lit the fuse. However it began, the ending was the same. The virus slipped its cage and moved through the facility on the air, in the water, in the blood, and it touched the men and women who worked there, the scientists and the guards and the cleaners, and one by one they sickened and died and did not stay dead. This is the terrible gift of the T-virus, the thing Marcus wove into it from the leech and the flower. It does not simply kill. It empties a body of its mind and itself and its soul, and then it makes that empty body walk again, driven only by a blind and endless hunger, a dead thing that hunts the living, that feels no pain and knows no fear and cannot be reasoned with or begged. The dead of the Arklay labs rose, and they hunted the few who still lived, and the few who still lived tried to seal the doors, to contain the horror, to keep it from climbing up out of the mountain and into the world. They failed. The plague spread through the labs and up into the mansion and out into the forests, where the animals drank the tainted water and the birds ate the tainted flesh, and the whole ecosystem of the Arklay Mountains began quietly to turn. Dogs became something worse than dogs. Snakes swelled to monstrous size, and in the deep cells the old experiments, Lisa Trevor and the sleeping tyrants, stirred in the changing dark. Reports reached Raccoon City. People had gone missing in the mountains. Hikers had vanished. Strange and savage killings troubled the woods. Bodies found half-eaten. Wounds that no ordinary animal could explain. The city's police, its STRS teams, its brave and ordinary men and women, were sent up into the forest to find the cause. They were walking, though none of them knew it, straight into the heart of the flower's long nightmare, into the beautiful, terrible house where the dead did not rest. They came into the mountains in July, the men and women of STRS, Raccoon City Special Tactics Teams, sent to investigate the killings in the woods. First the Bravo team, and when Bravo vanished, the Alpha team after them. And in the dark of the forest, hunted by things that had once been dogs, they fled toward the only shelter they could find, a great and beautiful mansion standing silent among the trees. They did not know it was Umbrella's. They did not know it was the very heart of the horror. They only knew that the night was full of teeth, and that the house promised walls and doors and a moment's safety. They were wrong about the safety. Inside the mansion, they found a nightmare dressed as elegance. The dead walked its halls. Its rooms held monsters and puzzles and locked doors, and the pale green glow of the labs sunk far below. Among the Alpha team were the ones whose names this story will not forget. Chris Redfield, brave and stubborn and loyal. Jill Valentine, sharp and steady and unbreakable. Barry Burton, the kind and burdened family man. And their captain, Albert Wesker, who wore his sunglasses even in the dark, and who was not lost at all, but exactly where he wished to be. For this was Wesker's stage, the disaster he had helped to make. He had led his own team into the trap, meaning to gather combat data on Umbrella's monsters as they killed his comrades one by one, and then to vanish with the results and begin his ascension. Through the long night, the survivors fought their way deeper into the house, learning its secrets as they went, discovering the labs beneath, uncovering the truth of Umbrella, of the flower, of the corporation their whole city trusted. They found Lisa Trevor in the dark, the girl who could not die, and they set her, at last, in ways they scarcely understood, upon the road toward the rest she had been denied for decades. And they found, in the deepest lab, the thing Umbrella had been building toward all along, the perfect weapon, the crown of the T-virus, the first of the great tyrants. But before they could face it, they had to face the traitor among them, the captain who had never been their captain, the cold man who had watched from behind his glasses and waited for them to do his work. Deep in the labs beneath the mansion, Albert Wesker let the mask fall at last. He revealed himself to the survivors, the traitor in the heart of STARS, and he gloried in it, in the cold theatre of his own cleverness, in the ruin he had helped to bring about. He had loosed the tyrant, the great pale weapon, and he meant to use it to finish the survivors he no longer needed. But Wesker's schemes ran deeper still, deeper than his comrades knew, deeper even than Umbrella knew. For this was the night he had chosen to die. In his coat, he carried the virus he had been given, the serum that killed and then returned a man changed. And in the labs beneath the mansion, in the moment of his greatest triumph, he took it. He let his own tyrant strike him down, a wound that should have been the end, and he fell, and his heart stilled. And to the survivors, and to the world, Albert Wesker died there in the dark. But he did not stay dead. The virus did its cold and patient work, and where Wesker had fallen, something more than Wesker began, slowly, to rise. The dead heart stirred and beat again. The still blood moved, and when he woke as the thing he had always wished to be, faster than any human eye could follow, stronger than any human hand could match, his senses sharpened past all mortal measure, his eyes gone the burning red gold of a predator. He had shed his humanity at last, or so he told himself, and stepped through the doorway the flower had always promised, and become the superior being of his cold and lifelong dream. He rose from his own death and slipped away into the dark, unseen, presumed a corpse, free now to pursue his true work, without the burden of a name or a face the world could follow. The survivors escaped the mansion as it burned, believing their traitor dead, never guessing that the coldest player in the whole terrible game had only just begun. For Wesker's rebirth changed everything. Umbrella still stood, but its most dangerous servant now served only himself, carrying its secrets in his transformed body, playing the long game across the years to come, waiting for the flower to bloom into the final horror that would let him remake the world. He was patient. He had all the time that the dead have, and he would be there again and again in the dark corners of every disaster still to come, watching, always watching, from behind his burning eyes. Turn back for a moment to the very edge of the mansion incident, to the hours just before, and to the youngest of all the STRS, a girl of 18 named Rebecca Chambers, the medic of the Doom Bravo team. When Bravo's helicopter went down in the mountains, Rebecca was scattered from her comrades, alone in the dark forest with the dead beginning to walk. And there, on a stalled luxury train called the Ecliptic Express, halted among the trees, she met a man she'd been taught to fear, an escaped convict named Billy Cohen, a former soldier condemned to die for a massacre he swore he did not commit. Two strangers, an innocent-seeming lawman and a supposed murderer, thrown together in the heart of the outbreak, learning slowly to trust each other because there was no one else in all the world left to trust. The train, they discovered, was Umbrella's, and it was already infected, the dead rising among its velvet seats and crystal chandeliers. And as Rebecca and Billy fought their way through it, they came at last to the thing that had loosed the plague. For this was the night that James Marcus finally woke. 10 years his ruined body had lain in the flooded dark, wrapped in his beloved leeches, growing, dreaming, hating. And now the thing that wore his face rose up to take its vengeance upon Umbrella, upon Spencer, upon the whole cold world that had murdered him and stolen his life's work. He commanded his leeches like a swarm of a single mind, and he loosed the T-virus through the mountains, and the outbreak that would doom Raccoon City had, in a sense, been his revenge all along. The wounded love of a lonely man poured out at last as poison over the world that wronged him. Rebecca and Billy faced the resurrected Marcus in the drowned facility, this echo of a founder, this grief made monstrous, and they ended him, or believed they did. And when it was over, when the sun rose on the ruin, Rebecca let Billy go free, this condemned man who had proven himself no monster at all, and she reported him dead, and carried on alone toward the mansion and the longer nightmare waiting there. There is a small and gentle mercy in that, a young medic choosing to believe in a stranger's goodness in the middle of so much horror. One act of trust and kindness in the cold heart of the flower's long harvest. It would not save Raccoon City. Nothing could save Raccoon City now. But it is worth remembering, in the dark, that even here, even now, some small human tenderness still flickered against the night. The survivors came down out of the mountains as the mansion burned behind them, carrying the truth like a wound. Chris Redfield, Jill Valentine, and the others of STARS knew now what Umbrella was. They had seen the labs, the monsters, the dead made to walk. They had learned that their captain was a traitor, that their city's great benefactor was a maker of plagues, that the horror in the woods had a corporate shield stamped upon its every cell. And they went to the authorities, as brave and honest people do, and they laid out the truth, and they demanded that something be done. And nothing was done, for Umbrella owned Raccoon City, root and branch. It owned the police chief, a corrupt and swaggering man named Brian Irons, bought long ago with the corporation's money and the corporation's darker favors. It owned the mayor and the council and the newspapers, and so the survivors' desperate testimony was buried, dismissed, laughed away. Their evidence vanished. Their credibility was quietly poisoned. The mansion, they were told, had never held any such thing, and the whole harrowing night was recast as trauma, or delusion, or lies. The corporation closed over the truth like dark water over a dropped stone, and the ripples stilled, and to the world it was as if nothing had happened at all. Chris and the others were not fools. They understood that the fight would not be won in Raccoon City, that the corruption ran too deep, that to strike at Umbrella, they would have to go elsewhere, gather proof the corporation could not bury, find allies beyond its reach, and so they began, quietly, to scatter and to organize, to become something other than city police, to lay the first foundations of the long war against the corporation that would consume the rest of their lives. Chris left for Europe, chasing Umbrella's trail to its heart. Others went underground, and Jill Valentine stayed in Raccoon City a while longer, watching, waiting, uneasy in a town that had already begun, in small ways, to sicken. For the mansion's destruction had not ended the plague. It had only driven it underground, into the labs beneath the city, into the water and the dark. The corporation, terrified that the Arclay disaster would be repeated in the very heart of a populated town, worked feverishly to contain what could not be contained. And beneath the ordinary streets, in the tunnels and the sewers, the Flowers' children were already stirring, and the doom of Raccoon City delayed a little while, drew steadily, patiently, nearer. For 2 months, Raccoon City lived in the shadow of a secret, it did not know it kept. The mansion had burned, but the T-virus had not. It lingered in the deep labs beneath the city, in Birkin's facility, in the tunnels and the water, and slowly, invisibly, it began to spread. It seeped into the drainage. It rode in the rats. It touched here and there, a worker in the wrong tunnel, a vagrant in the wrong sewer, and where it touched, the dead began quietly to walk in the dark places no one looked. Umbrella knew. Of course Umbrella knew. And rather than warn the city, rather than empty the streets and burn the source and save the innocent, the corporation chose, as it always chose, to protect its secrets and its profits and itself. It studied the spread. It collected its data. It moved its most precious assets, its viruses and its research, deeper into hiding, and it kept the shield up and the town blind and the ordinary evenings ordinary, while the rot climbed slowly toward the surface. This is perhaps the coldest crime in all of Umbrella's long ledger of crimes, colder than any monster it made. Not the accident that loosed the plague, but the choice, made in clean offices by men in good suits, to let a whole city die rather than admit what it had done. Every day that Umbrella stayed silent, the plague climbed higher. Every day, more of the dark tunnels filled with the walking dead. And still, the corporation waited and calculated and let the ordinary people of Raccoon City drink their tainted water and walk their doomed streets and love their children in the last warm evenings they would ever know. Meanwhile, in the deepest lab, William Birkin's own reckoning had come. His G-virus was finished at last, his God complete, and Umbrella, exactly as he had feared, had decided to take it from him. The corporation sent its soldiers down into the dark to seize the virus and dispose of its maker, this brilliant man who knew too much and held too dear a prize. They found him in his lab, guarding his life's work, and when he would not yield it, they shot him and left him for dead among the wreckage of his dream. But William Birkin, like so many in this story, did not die when he should have. In his final agony, reaching for the only thing he had ever truly loved, he took the G-virus into his own body, and what rose from the floor of that lab was no longer a man, and no longer a scientist, and no longer, in any way that mattered, William Birkin. It was God, as he had named it, and it was hungry. When it came at last, it came fast, faster than anyone could have imagined, and the town that Umbrella built died in a matter of days. The soldiers who shot William Birkin had spilled his precious virus in the fight, and the rats that fed upon his blood carried the G-virus and the T-virus together up out of the labs and into the city above, into the water, into the streets, into the veins of Raccoon City all at once, and the plague, so long held back, so patiently climbing, broke over the town like a black wave. People sickened in their homes. The dead rose in the hospitals and the streets and the quiet family kitchens. Within days, the ordinary town of quiet homes and warm diners became a charnel house, its streets choked with the walking dead, its air thick with smoke and screaming, its living hunted through the wreckage of the only world they had ever known. Umbrella's blindness had become Raccoon City's grave. The authorities tried to hold the line and failed, and the police made their stand at the great stone station house and were overrun, and the army sealed the roads and could not stop the spread. In a matter of days, tens of thousands of ordinary people, mothers and children, and old men and shopkeepers, were dead, or worse than dead, shuffling through the ruins of their town with the flowers' hunger where their souls had been. There is no more terrible picture in all this long history than Raccoon City in those final days. a whole community devoured whole, an entire world of small and precious lives snuffed out to protect the secrets of a corporation that had marked them for spending all along. And into this dying city, on the very last nights of its life, two strangers came, each for reasons of their own, neither knowing what they were walking into. One was a young man, a rookie police officer arriving for his very first day of work, hours too late to find a police force that still lived. His name was Leon Kennedy. The other was a young woman on a desperate search for her lost brother, riding into the ruins on the strength of love alone. Her name was Claire Redfield, and her brother was Chris, of STRS, already gone to Europe on the long war against Umbrella. Leon and Claire met in the burning streets, two innocents in a city of the dead, and joined together to survive the longest night that either of them would ever know. They met in the fire and the ruin. Leon Kennedy and Claire Redfield, two young strangers thrown together in a dying city, and from the first moment they chose, without needing to speak of it, to help each other live. There is something quietly noble in that, in the way the two of them, frightened and outmatched and utterly unprepared, turned toward each other rather than away, shared what little they had, watched each other's backs through the horror. Leon had come to be a policeman, to serve and protect, and though the city he was sworn to had died before he ever put on the badge, he served it anyway, spending that first and only night saving whatever lives he could find in the wreckage. Claire had come only for her brother, driven across the country by a sister's stubborn love, and finding Chris gone, she turned that love outward, toward the strangers who needed her, toward a frightened child alone in the dark. They were separated early, the two of them, swept apart by the chaos of the streets, and each carried on alone through their own private nightmare, drawn always toward the great stone police station that stood at the heart of the dying town. That station had once been a museum, a grand and beautiful building of marble halls and hidden passages, and Chief Iron's Umbrella's bought and broken man had filled it with secrets and traps in his own private madness. Now it was a fortress of the dead, its halls choked with monsters, its rooms sealed by puzzles, a maze as cruel and beautiful as the Arclay mansion had been. Through it, Leon and Claire made their separate ways, and in it they found the others whose fates were bound to that terrible night. Leon met a woman in red, an agent named Ada Wong, beautiful and secretive, whose true purpose lay hidden behind every kindness, and Claire found the frightened child she had glimpsed in the streets, a small girl lost and hunted in the ruins, whose name was Sherry, and whose father was the very man whose ruin had loosed the plague, William Birkin, the maker of God. The threads of the whole long story were drawing together now, in the last hours of Raccoon City, the innocent and the guilty and the doomed, the child and the monster and the spy, all of them running through the same burning dark toward the same reckoning, while beneath the city, the thing that had been Birkin hunted its own blood through the sewers, hungry, relentless, and utterly beyond reason. Follow now the saddest thread in all the ruin of Raccoon City, the thread of William Birkin and the god he became. When Umbrella's soldiers shot him and he took the G-virus into his dying body, he ceased to be a man in any way the world would know. The virus rebuilt him, wave upon wave, into a thing of shifting flesh and grasping limbs and staring, senseless eyes, a monster that grew and changed and would not die, evolving past each wound as fast as it was dealt. But some cold ember of what he had been still burned in the heart of the horror. Not his mind, not his love, only the deepest and most primal drive the G-virus carried, the drive to reproduce, to pass itself on, to plant its seed in a body of compatible blood. And the blood most compatible with William Birkin's was the blood of his own daughter. So the god that had been a father hunted through the sewers of the dying city after the one person in all the world he should have died to protect, his little girl, Sherry, who fled through the dark from the shapeless thing that had been her dad. Consider the pure and awful sorrow of it. A man who loved his work more than his child, remade by that very work into a monster that would destroy his child to feed itself. The neglect of a lifetime curdled at the last into something monstrous and literal. The father become the predator, the maker of God become God's first and hungriest instrument. Sherry ran and hid, and survived by luck and courage far beyond her years, and Claire Redfield found her and took the frightened child under her protection and swore to see her safe out of the ruins. But the G-embryo had already touched Sherry, planted in her by the pursuing horror, a seed of the virus growing quietly inside a little girl. Only Annette Birkin, Sherry's mother, William's wife, could save her, and Annette was herself half mad now with grief and guilt, torn between the ruin of her husband and the danger to her child, working desperately in the last hours to undo what her family's obsession had wrought. The Birkins had built a god together, in the pale light of the labs, while their daughter grew up lonely in the shadows. And now the god was loose, and the father was a monster, and the mother was dying, and only a kind stranger stood between the little girl and the darkness her parents had made. That is what the flower does to a family. That is what ambition costs, in the end, paid always by the ones who never asked for any of it. While Leon and Claire fought through the heart of the city, another survivor moved through its western streets, and hers was a hunt within the hunt, a nightmare shaped for her alone. Jill Valentine of STARS, who had survived the mansion and stayed in Raccoon City ever since, uneasy, watchful, sensing the rot before it broke. Now the city was falling around her, and she meant to escape it. But Umbrella had not forgotten the men and women who knew its secrets, the STRS survivors who could still, one day, bring the corporation to account. And so, into the burning ruins, Umbrella loosed a weapon built to erase them. It was called the Nemesis. It was a tyrant, one of the great pale weapons, but refined into something new and terrible, armored, cunning, and given a single implacable purpose: to hunt down and kill every last member of STRS that still drew breath. And unlike the mindless dead, the Nemesis could think and plan and pursue. It could open doors, it could wield weapons, and it could speak, after a fashion, grinding out a single word over and over, the name of its prey, STRS, a death sentence spoken aloud in a voice like tearing metal. Through the whole of Jill's long night it came for her again and again, appearing without warning, unkillable, relentless, striking down her allies before her eyes, driving her through the dying city with the terror of something that would never, ever stop. There is a special horror in being hunted, in the knowledge that somewhere in the dark a thing is coming for you and you alone, that no wall is thick enough, no door strong enough, no distance far enough to make you safe. That was the Nemesis, the corporation's cold will made flesh, the long arm of Umbrella reaching into the ruin it had made to silence the last witnesses to its crimes. And yet Jill did not break. Hunted, wounded, exhausted, watching her friends fall one by one, she carried on, because the alternative was to lie down and let the corporation win, and Jill Valentine was not made for lying down. She found an ally in the ruins, a mercenary named Carlos Oliveira, one of Umbrella's own hired soldiers, sent into the city to help contain the disaster and slowly waking to the horror of who he served. Together, the hunted policewoman and the disillusioned mercenary made their long way through the fire, always with the nemesis at their heels, toward the faint and fragile hope of escape, while above them, the corporation, watching the city die, made its final and most terrible decision. Through the burning western streets, Jill Valentine and Carlos Oliveira fought toward survival, and the city fought to keep them. Everywhere the dead pressed in, everywhere the fires spread, and always, at the edge of every hope, the nemesis waited, patient and relentless, wearing Jill down with terror as much as with wounds. In the depths of that long night, the monster caught her at last and struck her with its infection, planting the T-virus in her blood, so that the hunter's prey began slowly to sicken with the very plague that had killed the city. Jill fell into fever, into the borderland between the living and the dead, and it was Carlos, the mercenary, who had begun the night as her enemy, who would not let her go. He carried her to shelter. He went out alone into the ruins, into the overrun hospital, to find the one thing that might save her, a vaccine hidden somewhere in Umbrella's facilities, a slim and desperate chance. And he found it, and he brought it back, and he drew her out of the fever's grip, this hired soldier who owed her nothing, who might so easily have saved only himself. There is a grace in that, a quiet redemption. A man who had served the corporation without knowing its crimes, choosing, when he saw the truth, to spend himself for a stranger's life. Not everyone in Umbrella's shadow was a monster. Some were only ordinary people, lied to as thoroughly as the city itself, who did the right thing the moment they understood what right and wrong had come to mean. Jill woke from her fever changed, hollowed, but alive, and the two of them pressed on, for the night was not over, and the worst of it still lay ahead. For Umbrella had watched its containment fail, watched the plague spill beyond every wall, watched Raccoon City become a beacon that would draw the eyes of the whole world down upon the corporation's darkest work. And in the cold offices where the town's fate had always been decided, a final choice was made, the coldest of all its cold choices, the erasure not of a secret, but of a city, the burning away of the evidence and the innocent alike. The clock was running now, counting down toward an ending that would swallow the whole of Raccoon City in a single blinding instant, and Jill and Carlos and Leon and Claire and the frightened child Sherry and all the last living souls in the dying town had only hours left to escape the sentence Umbrella had passed upon them all. The last hours of Raccoon City ran red with fire and fear, as its final survivors raced against a doom that fell now not from the plague, but from the sky. For above the dying city, the powers of the world had made their decision, and it was the same decision Umbrella would have made, the same the corporation had shaped events toward all along. Raccoon City would be sterilized, erased, burned from the earth in a single blinding stroke, so that the horror would be contained and the evidence destroyed, and the truth, once more, buried beneath the ash. A missile would fall at dawn, and everything beneath it, the dead and the living, the guilty and the innocent, the monsters and the children, would be gone. And so the last living souls fled through the ruins toward the edges of the city, toward the fragile hope of a way out before the sky came down. Leon and Claire, reunited at the last, fought their way through Umbrella's deepest lab beneath the city, where they faced the final ruin of William Birkin, the god grown vast and mindless and utterly beyond saving, and they ended it and they carried the child Sherry up out of the dark toward the light. Jill and Carlos made their own desperate run, and Jill, worn to the bone, turned at the last to face the nemesis one final time, this thing that had hunted her through the whole endless night, and she destroyed it, the corporation's implacable will broken at last by the woman it could not break. They reached the trains, the helicopters, the roads out, in the last grey minutes before the dawn, and they fled the city as the sky split open behind them. The missile fell, and Raccoon City, the ordinary town of quiet homes and warm diners, the town that Umbrella built and Umbrella spent, vanished in a single terrible flash, tens of thousands of lives and the ruin of them all swallowed in fire, the plague and the proof and the memory scoured together from the face of the earth. From a distance, the survivors watched their world burn. They had lived. A handful, out of all those thousands, had lived, but they carried out of the fire something Umbrella had not counted on, something the corporation could not burn. They carried the truth, and they carried a resolve, hardened now in the flame of everything they had lost, to see the corporation that had murdered a city answer, at last, for what it had done. Let us pause here, in the ash, and grieve for Raccoon City, before the story moves on and leaves it behind, as the world would leave it behind. For a city died there, a whole warm world of ordinary lives, and the manner of its dying was the truest confession Umbrella ever made. The corporation had built the town and used it and studied it, and when at last its experiments broke their cages, the corporation chose to burn the town rather than be exposed. And the wider world, learning too late and understanding too little, chose the same. A missile to seal the wound, a fire to swallow the shame. The official story would call it a tragedy, an accident, a terrible outbreak of unknown disease, and it would name no names and lay no blame. And quietly, over the months that followed, the whole horror would be smoothed away into a footnote, a strange, sad thing that had happened once, to a town no one need think about again. But the survivors would not let it be smoothed away. Leon Kennedy carried the memory of that night into a lifetime of service, drawn into the shadow work of governments, spending the rest of his years fighting the very horrors he had first met in the burning streets. Claire Redfield carried it into a life of activism, joining those who worked to drag the corporation's crimes into the light and to help the victims of bioterror wherever they were found. Jill and Chris and the scattered STRS carried it into open war. And little Sherry Birkin, the child who had lost both her parents to the flower's dream in a single night, carried it deepest of all. Taken into custody by the very government that had burned her city, watched over and studied because of the virus that had touched her, growing up in the long shadow of a disaster she had done nothing to cause. Raccoon City became a name spoken quietly, a wound in the century, a warning that too few would heed, and it became, for those who survived it, a kind of vow, never again, not while they lived. The corporation had spent a whole city to hide its sins, and in the spending had taught its enemies exactly what it was, and had lit, in the hearts of those who escaped the fire, a fury that would not rest until Umbrella itself lay in ash. The city was gone, but its echoes would not be silenced, and those echoes were already gathering into a storm that would, at last, bring the corporation down. Raccoon City was the wound that would not close. For all the corporation's power, for all its bought officials and buried evidence and burned cities, it could not undo what the world had glimpsed in the fire. Too many had survived. Too much had been seen. And in the months and years that followed the city's death, the truth of Umbrella began, slowly, unstoppably, to bleed out into the light. The survivors carried their testimony to those who would listen. Anti-Umbrella movements gathered strength, funded in the shadows by rivals and idealists alike. Governments that had once courted the corporation began, quietly, to turn against it, no longer able to pretend they did not know, no longer willing to be tied to a company whose sins had grown too large to hide. An Umbrella, which had ruled for decades from behind its shield of mercy, found that the shield had cracked, and that through the crack the whole world was beginning to see. The corporation fought back, of course. It buried what it could, bought whom it could, unleashed its lawyers and its assassins and its lies. But rot cannot be hidden forever once the smell of it is in the air. Umbrella's stock collapsed. Its partners fled. Its markets closed against it, one nation after another barring its doors. And the great river of money that had paid for everything began, at last, to run dry. And once the money failed, everything failed. For Umbrella had always been a house built on gold, and when the gold was gone, the house came down. Trials began. Investigations dug into places the corporation had kept dark for decades. The full and terrible ledger of its crimes, the tested towns, the murdered subjects, the plagues loosed and cities burned, was dragged, piece by piece, into the courtrooms and the newspapers of the world. And Oswell Spencer, the last of the founders, the cold old king, who had schemed and murdered his way to the summit of it all, watched his empire crumble beneath him and slipped away into hiding, into a remote castle at the edge of the world, to nurse his failing body and his failing dream. But even as the great corporation fell, its poison did not vanish. Its viruses had spread beyond its walls. Its scientists scattered, carrying their knowledge to new masters. Its research fell into 100 hungry hands, governments and cults and lone mad dreamers, each ready to take up the flower's terrible gift and carry the horror onward into a new and darker age. Umbrella was dying, but the thing it had loosed upon the world would not die with it. Through all the years of Umbrella's fall, one cold shadow moved unseen behind the ruin, gathering its pieces, weaving its long design. Albert Wesker, dead and risen, the superior being of his own cold dreams, had not been idle since the night he walked out of the burning Arklay mansion. He had faked his death and shed his name, and in the years that followed, he served no master but his own ambition, playing the corporations and the governments against one another, feeding the fall of Umbrella that he might feast upon its corpse. For Wesker understood what few others grasped, that the death of the great corporation was not the end of the flower's work, but the beginning of its wildest and most fertile age. The viruses were loose in the world now. The knowledge was scattered. And into that scattering, Wesker reached his cold hands, gathering samples, gathering data, gathering the ruined genius of the corporation to himself. He allied, in secret, with a shadowy organization that sought to inherit Umbrella's power, and he betrayed it in turn, always serving his own singular star, the dream of shedding humanity entirely and remaking the world in his own superior image. He collected the viruses like a connoisseur, studying each, weighing each against his purpose, searching always for the one perfect strain that would let him become the god he intended to be, and then remake all of humanity, or destroy it, and stand at last as the sole and final master of the earth. And he watched, from the shadows, the old players of the great game. He watched Chris Redfield, his former subordinate, hunting Umbrella's remnants across the world. He watched the survivors he had failed to kill grow into the very warriors who would one day stand against him. Perhaps some cold ember of contempt, or even of interest, stirred in him when he thought of Chris, the stubborn ordinary man who had refused to die on cue, who kept rising again and again against the darkness Wesker served. For now, Wesker only watched and gathered and planned. His hour was not yet come. The flower had not yet bloomed into the final horror he required. But he was patient, with the terrible patience of the deathless, and he moved through the ruins of Umbrella's empire like a ghost through a graveyard, taking what he needed, leaving no trace, always drawing nearer to the dark apotheosis he had promised himself on the night he chose to die. And somewhere in the frozen south, an old obsession of the Ashford line was about to wake and draw the players of the game together once more upon an island prison at the edge of the world. While the corporation crumbled, an old wound of the Ashford family tore open at the edge of the world, on a remote and secret island called Rockfort. There, on the anniversary of Raccoon City's death, Claire Redfield's long search for her brother Chris had led her at last into Umbrella's hands, and into a prison from which few ever walked free. But on the very day of her capture, the island came under attack by Umbrella's enemies, and in the chaos of fire and gunfire the prisoners were loosed, and the T-virus, ever present in Umbrella's dark places, spilled once more into the world, and the dead began again to walk. Claire fought her way through the burning island, and there she met a young prisoner named Steve Burnside, bitter and frightened and brave beneath his bitterness, another innocent caught in the corporation's machinery. Together they sought escape, and together they uncovered the strange and doomed heart of Rockfort Island, the last mad flowering of the Ashford line. For the island was ruled by Alfred Ashford, one of the twins Alexander had made, and Alfred had gone entirely into madness in the long years of his sister's frozen sleep. Alone, isolated, worshipping the memory of Alexia, he had come to wear her clothes and speak in her voice, to become, in his broken mind, both twins at once, keeping her alive in himself because he could not bear to be without her. He hunted Claire and Steve through the island with a sniper's patience and a madman's glee, this ruined heir playing at cruelty in the ruins of his family's greatness. And when at last he fell, dying, he did the only thing his shattered devotion still cried out for. He went to wake his sister. He flew to the family's Antarctic base, to the frozen chamber where Alexia had slept for 15 years, and there, with the last of his strength, he broke her long sleep and called her back into the world, the queen he had waited his whole ruined life to serve. Claire and Steve and Chris himself, who had come at last in search of the sister he had never stopped seeking, would follow the Ashfords down into the ice, into the final chapter of a family that had chased greatness across 3 generations and found only madness and ruin at the end of the chase. For Alexia was awake now, and she was everything her ambition had promised, and the frozen south was about to become a furnace. In the white silence of Antarctica, at the bottom of the world, the Ashford line came at last to its terrible flower. Alexia Ashford woke from her 15-year sleep of ice, and the T. Veronica virus had done exactly the work she had planned, spreading through her sleeping flesh in perfect harmony, so that she rose not as a ruined monster, but as something cold and beautiful, and utterly beyond the human, a queen of the flowers making. Her blood turned to fire, her will absolute. She looked upon the world with the contempt of a goddess for the insects beneath her, and she meant to remake it, to spread her virus across the earth, to reign over a transformed humanity as the last and greatest of the Ashfords, the vindication of every generation's grasping dream. Into her frozen kingdom came Claire and Steve, fleeing the ruin of Rockfort, and Chris Redfield after them, and Albert Wesker too, drawn like every predator to the scent of a new and perfect virus. For Wesker coveted Alexia's T. Veronica for his own collection, another key perhaps to the godhood he sought. The final hours of the Ashfords unfolded in fire and ice. Steve Burnside, the bitter young prisoner who had learned too late to care for Claire more than for his own survival, gave his life to save hers, twisted by the virus into a monster and freed from it only in death. One more innocence spent in the long harvest of the flower, and Alexia, the Coal Queen, for all her terrible power, fell at last before Chris Redfield, ordinary and stubborn and unbreakable, who would not bow to gods, who burned the frozen kingdom down around her and ended the Ashford line forever in the ice. Consider what the Ashfords had come to. Edward, the gentlest of the founders, the one who had truly wished to heal, had begotten a line that grasped for greatness across 3 doomed generations, and found in the end only madness and monstrousness and death at the bottom of the world. Alexander, undone by his own ambition into a mindless thing. Alfred, lost in the ruins of his own devotion. Alexia, the perfect monster, burned in the ice she had chosen for her cradle. A family that reached always for immortality and won only oblivion. And through the fire of their ending moved Wesker, patient and cold, gathering his samples, testing Chris in single combat, and finding, perhaps to his own surprise, that the ordinary man could stand against him. Wesker withdrew to plan and to wait, his collection richer by one more virus, his long game not yet ready to close. And the Ashfords passed out of the world as Umbrella itself was passing, leaving behind only their poison and the long echo of their fall. The great Umbrella Corporation, which had ruled from behind its shield for the better part of 40 years, did not die in fire or in battle, but in a courtroom, quietly, the way old empires often die. The trials that Raccoon City had made possible ground on through the early years of the new century, and one by one the corporation's crimes were dragged into the light, its buried horrors exhumed, its bought protectors stripped away, until at last there was nothing left to save. In the year 2003, the Umbrella Corporation was dissolved. Its stock was worthless. Its assets were seized. Its name, once spoken with trust in 100 nations, became a byword for horror, a thing whispered with a shudder, the corporation that had murdered a city to hide its sins. The shield came down, and to the world, it seemed that a great evil had at last been ended, that the long nightmare that began with a flower in an African cave had finally run its course, that the age of Umbrella was over, and the age of horror with it. But those who had lived through the fire knew better. They knew that Umbrella had never truly been the disease, only its largest and most visible carrier. The flower's gift was loose in the world now, scattered far beyond any single corporation's walls. Umbrella's scientists had fled to new masters. Its viruses had been copied, stolen, sold, and improved upon in 100 secret laboratories. Its research had become the seed of a whole new industry of horror, the age of bioterror, in which not one great corporation but 1,000 hungry hands reached for the power to unmake and remake the living. Rival companies rose to inherit what Umbrella had lost. Some no better than the corpse they fed upon. Governments built their own dark programs, telling themselves they were only defending against the threat and becoming the threat in the doing. Cults and terrorists and lone mad dreamers took up the flower's gift and bent it to their own strange ends. The corporation was dead. The horror was healthier than ever. And so the survivors of Raccoon City did not lay down their arms when Umbrella fell. They understood that the war had only changed its shape, that the enemy was no longer one shield, but a hydra of many heads, that the long fight against the flower's children would outlast them all. New organizations rose to meet the new age, agencies and alliances dedicated to fighting bioterror wherever it bloomed. And the old survivors, Chris and Jill and Leon and Claire, took their place in this new war, no longer hunting a single corporation, but standing guard, forever now, against a darkness that had learned to wear 1,000 faces. Turn now away from viruses and corporations, away from the flower and its many children, to an older horror entirely, sleeping for centuries in the soil of a forgotten corner of Europe. For not all the terrors of this world were born in Umbrella's labs. Some were older by far, waiting in the earth long before the founders ever dreamed of their pale flower. In a remote and isolated region of rural Spain, in a land of stone villages and ancient castles and people who had kept to the old ways for 1,000 years, there slept in the ground a parasite of terrible antiquity. It was called the Plaga, and it was not a virus, but a living thing, a creature that took root inside a human host and grew there, seizing the body, and in time the mind, binding the infected into a single hive will beneath the command of whoever controlled the parasite's queen. In ages past, the lords of that land had used the Plagas to rule their people through fear and domination, until at last some braver generation had risen up and sealed the parasites away deep beneath the earth and buried the horror and tried to forget it. For centuries the Plagas slept in their tombs, and the villages above them lived quiet lives, and the memory of the old domination faded into folklore and warning and the strange, uneasy customs of an isolated people. But buried horrors have a way of being dug up again by those who would use them. And in the early years of the new century, a man came to that forgotten land who looked upon the sleeping parasites and saw not a horror to be feared but a power to be seized. His name was Osmond Sadler, and he was a prophet of a kind, the leader of a cult he called Los Iluminados, the Enlightened, and he meant to wake the old parasites and use them to build a kingdom of the mind enslaved, and through them to reach out and seize control of the wider world. Sadler unearthed the Plagas from their ancient tombs, and he took them into himself and into his followers, and he spread them through the villages of that isolated land, until the quiet people who had lived there for 1,000 years became, one by one, the hollow-eyed servants of his single will. The old horror woke, and it hungered, as it had always hungered, to spread. Here was a new kind of monster for a new age, not the mindless walking dead of the T-virus, but the coordinated, cunning slaves of the Plaga, a whole society bound into one purpose, waiting in their stone village for a stranger to come, so that the parasite might reach, through him, toward the halls of power in the wider world. Osmond Sadler was a different breed of monster from the cold scientists and colder aristocrats who had come before. He did not dream, as Spencer had dreamed, of curing death, nor as Wesker dreamed of transcending humanity. Sadler's hunger was older and simpler, and in some ways more terrible. He wished only to rule absolutely and forever, to bind every mind on earth to his single will, to be worshipped as a god by a humanity emptied of its own thoughts and filled with his. And in the ancient Plaga, he had found the perfect instrument, a parasite that turned free men into devoted slaves, that made of a whole population one obedient body, hollowed of self and filled with fervor. He gathered his cult, Los Iluminados, and he spread the parasite through the isolated land he had claimed, and he built there a hidden kingdom of the enslaved, a society of the hollow-eyed, laboring and worshipping and waiting under the spell of the thing that grew inside them. The lords of the region, the old noble families, he bound to himself as well, and made them his lieutenants, twisting their pride and their hungers to his purpose. Chief among them was the master of the great castle, a diminished nobleman named Ramon Salazar, the last of an ancient line, small and strange and swollen with the borrowed importance the cult had given him. Salazar had inherited the guardianship of the sealed plagas, a duty his ancestors had kept for generations, and he had betrayed it utterly, opening the tombs his forefathers had sworn to keep shut, delivering the old horror into Sadler's hands out of vanity and a hunger to matter. And there were others, the military commander, the enforcers, the whole apparatus of a cult that had become a kingdom. Sadler's design was patient and vast. He would not simply enslave one hidden corner of Europe. He would use it as a seed. He would plant his parasite in a target of the highest importance, and through that target reach into the very heart of a great nation's power, and from there spread his dominion outward, mind by mind, until the whole world knelt. And the target he chose, the seed of his grand design, was a young woman of great importance, the daughter of the most powerful man in a powerful nation. Her name was Ashley Graham, and her kidnapping into the heart of Sadler's Stone Kingdom would draw into that forgotten land the one man least likely to bow to any god, a survivor of Raccoon City, who had learned, in fire, exactly how to fight a horror wearing a human face. Years had passed since the fire of Raccoon City, and Leon Kennedy, the rookie who had lost his first city on his first day, had become something far harder and more capable. His courage that terrible night had not gone unnoticed. The government that burned Raccoon City had also, in its way, recognized what he was and had taken him into its shadow service, training him hard and long, until the frightened young officer became one of the nation's most trusted agents, a man sent alone into the darkest places to do the work that could not be spoken of. And when the daughter of the president vanished, taken by unknown hands, it was Leon who was sent to find her. His search led him across the sea, into the remote and isolated land of Sadler's kingdom, into a region that did not appear on any ordinary map, a place of grey villages and ancient castles, where the people watched a stranger with hollow, hostile eyes. Leon came into that land alone, as he had once walked the burning streets of Raccoon City alone, and he found there a horror he had never met before, not the shambling dead, but the swift and cunning slaves of the Plaga, whole villages of them, ordinary-seeming peasants who turned upon him as one, coordinated, purposeful, bound by the parasite into a single murderous will. They came at him with tools and torches and terrible patience, and behind their hollow eyes he glimpsed the thing that drove them, the old parasite waking to its ancient work. Leon fought through the village and the countryside, and toward the great castle beyond, following the trail of the kidnapped young woman, learning as he went the shape of the horror he had walked into. He found Ashley Graham held captive deep in Sadler's domain, a frightened young woman as out of place in that nightmare as he had once been, and he took her under his protection and swore to bring her home, and the two of them began the long and desperate flight out of the parasite's kingdom. But Sadler had not chosen Ashley by chance, and he did not mean to simply let her go. She was the seed of his whole design, and before Leon ever reached her, the cult had already done to her what it had done to 1,000 villagers. The Plaga was inside her now, growing quietly, a seed of Sadler's will planted in the daughter of a president, waiting to bloom. And it was inside Leon too, planted by the cult in the first hours of his coming, a countdown ticking in his own blood toward the moment he would become another hollow slave of the thing he had come to destroy. The land Leon walked through was a nightmare of the ordinary, and that was its particular horror. There were no laboratories here, no pale green light over specimen tanks, no marble mansions hiding secret labs. There were only villages, stone cottages and muddy lanes, and the small, honest architecture of rural life. And in them dwelt a people who had lived simply for 1,000 years, and who were now, every one of them, something hollow and hostile and wrong. Leon moved among them like a man walking through a poisoned dream, hunted at every turn by farmers and fishermen and old women, by whole communities turned into a single hunting pack, and he could not tell himself, as he might have with the mindless dead, that these had never been people. They had been people, and recently mothers and sons and neighbors, and the thing inside them had not killed them, but enslaved them, hollowed out their selves, and filled the empty space with Sadler's will. There is a deeper dread in that than in any zombie's hunger. The dead at least are gone. The Plaga's victims were still there, in some sense, still walking in their own bodies and their own homes, but no longer themselves, no longer free, prisoners in their own flesh beneath a parasite's dominion. Leon fought his way through them because he had to, because they would have torn him apart. But the horror of it must have sat heavy on a man who had already watched one town of ordinary people devoured whole. He found allies of a strange sort in that land, a mysterious merchant who appeared in the oddest corners, trading in the tools of survival, and moving through the shadows at the edge of his story, a woman he knew, the woman in red from the burning ruins of Raccoon City, Ada Wong, present again as she was so often present, at the heart of great and secret events, serving purposes she would not name. Leon pressed on through the village and its terrors, toward the great castle where Ashley was held, gathering as he went the pieces of the truth, the cult, the parasite, the old horror woken and turned to a madman's design. And always, in his own blood, the seed grew, the plaga that the cult had planted in him, a slow doom ticking toward the hour when he too would fall under Sadler's spell, and become one more hollow slave in the parasite's endless choir. He was racing now against two clocks, the one that counted down to Ashley's ruin, and the one that counted down to his own, and the whole of that poisoned land stood between him and the saving of either. Beyond the villages rose the castle, and if the countryside had been a nightmare of the ordinary, the castle was a nightmare of the grand, a vast and ancient pile of stone and shadow, of long galleries and torture chambers and traps laid by generations of a family that had guarded a terrible secret and, at the last, betrayed it. Here dwelt Ramon Salazar, the diminished lord of the domain, the last of a noble line that had once been keepers of the sealed plagas. Salazar was a strange and pitiable figure for all his cruelty, a small man aged strangely by the parasite's touch, swollen with a borrowed grandeur, playing the gracious host and the sadistic tormentor by turns as he hunted Leon and Ashley through the halls of his ancestral home. He had opened the tombs his forefathers swore to keep shut. He had delivered the old horror into Sadler's hands, out of vanity, out of a hunger to be more than the small forgotten lord of a forgotten land. And now he served the cult with the fervor of a convert, sending his hollow servants and his monstrous guardians against the intruder who threatened his master's design. Through the castle, Leon fought, and Ashley beside him, or torn from him by turns, the two of them separated and reunited again and again as the cult sought to seize her back. And everywhere the marks of the old horror lay upon the place, the iconography of Los Iluminados, the instruments of the parasite's dominion, the long evidence of a noble house rotted from within by the thing it had been sworn to guard. Salazar threw everything he had against them, his traps and his monsters and his hollow legions, and at the last he threw himself, fusing with a great plaga monster in a final desperate bid to destroy the man who had unmade his master's plans. And he fell, as they all fell before Leon in the end, the small, proud lord undone by the very horror he had freed to make himself great. There is a pattern in it, repeated across this whole long history, the grasping for a greatness that is not one's own, the seizing of a power that always, always turns upon the one who seizes it. Spencer and the flower, the Ashfords and their virus, Salazar and the plaga he unearthed, to matter more than his small life allowed. Each reached past the bounds of their humanity, and each was devoured by the thing they reached for. The castle fell behind Leon as he pressed on, toward the island beyond, toward Sadler himself, and toward the woman in red whose true purpose was about to surface at last. Move now to the woman who threads through so much of this history, appearing and vanishing at the edges of every disaster, always beautiful, always secret, always serving purposes she will not name. Ada Wong. She had been in Raccoon City on the night it died, moving through the burning streets on some errand of her own, drawing close to Leon and then away, saving his life and using him by turns, a spy in the service of shadows Leon could only guess at. And now she was here again, in Sadler's Poison Kingdom, moving through the same nightmare toward her own hidden goal. For Ada served in these years the coldest of all the masters in this long tale. She served Albert Wesker, and Wesker, ever the collector, ever the patient god-in-waiting, had sent her into Sadler's land to steal a sample of the plaga, this ancient parasite so unlike the viruses in his growing horde, another possible key to the transformation he sought. Ada moved through the castle and the island in her own parallel nightmare, fighting the same hollow legions Leon fought, pursuing the same dark heart of the cult, but toward an end that served Wesker's cold ambition rather than Leon's simple mission of rescue. And yet, Ada was never simply a villain. That was the mystery of her, the thing that made her more than a spy. Again and again, in the midst of serving her shadowy masters, she chose to help Leon, to save him from a death he did not see coming, to leave in his path the tool or the weapon or the word he needed to survive. She served Wesker, and she deceived Wesker. She stole the sample he wanted, and she did not give it to him as he intended. She played her own long game, in the spaces between the games of greater and colder powers, keeping some private compass of her own beneath all the deception, some flicker of loyalty or affection or simple decency that no master had ever quite bought. Perhaps she loved Leon in her guarded and impossible way. Perhaps she only would not see a good man die when a small kindness could save him. Whatever moved her, she moved through the horror as a thing apart, neither wholly for it nor wholly against it, a woman of shadows keeping one small light burning where no one could see. And in the end, when Sadler fell and the Poison Kingdom burned, Ada took the sample she had come for and vanished, as she always vanished, leaving Leon alive and leaving her true purposes and her true heart as veiled as ever in the drifting dark. Leon came at last to the heart of the poisoned kingdom, to the island fortress beyond the castle, where Osmond Sadler waited at the center of his web, and where the countdown in Leon's own blood ran toward its final hour. He had found Ashley again, and lost her, and found her, the two of them dragged apart and driven back together by the cult's relentless hunger to reclaim the seed of its design. Now, in the island's cold laboratories, Leon uncovered the last truths of the horror he had walked into, the full scope of Sadler's plan, the reach the prophet meant to have into the very heart of the world's power through the enslaved daughter of a president. And he found, too, the means of his own salvation, for the parasite that grew in him and in Ashley might yet be burned out, the seed removed before it bloomed, if only they could survive long enough to reach the machinery that might do it. Sadler threw the last of his forces against them, his hollow legions, his monstrous guardians, the whole apparatus of his kingdom bent upon stopping the man who had unmade every part of his design. And at the last, Sadler faced Leon himself, casting off the mask of the prophet and rising in his true and monstrous form. The parasite's chosen host, swollen into a horror worthy of the ancient evil he had freed. It was a long and terrible battle at the edge of the world between the survivor of Raccoon City and the would-be god of the enslaved mind. And Sadler fell. As Spencer's empire had fallen, as the Ashfords had fallen, as Salazar had fallen, the prophet of Los Illuminados was destroyed, his kingdom of the hollow-eyed collapsing with him, the old parasite driven back at last into the dark from which it had been so foolishly raised. Leon and Ashley escaped the burning island together, the seeds burned from their blood, the daughter of the president delivered at last from the horror that had claimed her. And Ada slipped away with her stolen sample, and Wesker, watching from his cold distance, added the plaga to his growing horde and drew one step nearer to the transformation he sought. The old world's horror had been beaten back, but not the deeper pattern of it, the endless human hunger to seize a power beyond all bounds and bend the living to a single will. That hunger did not die with Sadler. It only moved on into new hands, into a new and darker age of bioterror, in which the survivors of every past horror would find themselves called again and again to stand against the flower's endless children. Out of the ashes of Umbrella and the long years of bioterror that followed, the world at last began to organize its defense, and the survivors of the old horrors found new banners to fight beneath. For it had become clear, by now, that the age of the single great corporation was over, and the age of the scattered plague had begun, in which any nation, any cult, any madman with money and knowledge might loose a new horror upon the world. Against this hydra, new powers rose. There came into being an alliance dedicated wholly to the fight against bioterror, a global body of soldiers and scientists trained to meet the flower's children wherever they bloomed, and it was called the Bioterrorism Security Assessment Alliance, the BSAA. And into its ranks came the old warriors of Raccoon City and the war against Umbrella, chief among them Chris Redfield, who had spent his life hunting the corporation and now turned that lifetime of hard experience to the wider war. Chris became one of the BSAA's finest, a soldier who had seen the horror at its very source and had never once turned away from it, carrying into every new battle the memory of the mansion, the fire, the friends he had lost. Alongside the soldiers rose the healers and the advocates, organizations devoted not to fighting the horror with guns, but to helping its victims, exposing its makers, dragging the crimes of the bioterror age into the light. Chief among these was TerraSave, and into its ranks came Claire Redfield, Chris's sister, who had carried the fire of Raccoon City into a life of activism, working now to shield the innocent from the horrors that powerful men kept loosing upon the world. The Redfield siblings, torn apart on the night Raccoon City died, had each found their way to the front lines of the same long war, one with a rifle and one with a cause, both of them shaped forever by the flower's touch. And Leon Kennedy, the government's trusted agent, moved through his own shadow of that same war, sent into the darkest corners of the world to do the work that could not be spoken of. A new generation of guardians had risen, forged in the fires of the old disasters, standing watch now against a darkness that had learned to bloom in 1,000 places at once. They could not end the horror. No one could end it now, for the flower's gift was loose in the world beyond all recalling. But they could stand against it, disaster by disaster, city by city, life by life, holding back the dark a little longer, buying the world a little more time. And there would be no shortage of disasters to meet. The new age of bioterror was a scattered and shadowy thing, and its horrors came not from one great corporation, but from 100 hidden hands, each with its own hunger, its own design, its own strain of the flower's endless gift. Rival corporations that had risen from Umbrella's corpse pursued the old dream of profit through plague. Governments built secret programs, telling themselves they only guarded against the threat, and in the guarding became the threat. Terrorists and cults and lone mad idealists took up the viruses and the parasites and bent them to ends stranger and darker than Spencer had ever imagined. And so the guardians of the new age found themselves called again and again to places the maps forgot, to floating cities and drowned facilities and remote islands where some new horror had bloomed in the dark. One such horror rose upon the sea in the years of the BSAA's early work, when a shining floating city, a marvel of the new century built upon the water, was struck by a bioterror attack of terrible cunning. The city was called Terra Grigia, a jewel upon the ocean, a promise of the future, and a terrorist group unleashed within it a new strain of horror, a virus born of the deep places of the sea, and the shining city became a nightmare of the transformed and the dead. And the response to that horror was itself a horror, for those who governed the crisis chose, as the world had chosen with Raccoon City, to erase what they could not save, to burn the shining city from the sea rather than risk the plague's escape. Terra Grigia fell into fire and salt water, its people spent to contain the disaster. Another city sacrificed on the altar of secrecy and fear. And in the shadow of that burning deeper conspiracies moved, betrayals within the very organizations sworn to fight the horror, agents playing double games, powerful men engineering disasters to serve their own hidden ends. For this was the deepest truth of the bioterror age, darker even than the monsters it spawned. The line between those who fought the horror and those who made it had grown perilously thin. The same knowledge that built the defense could build the plague. The same men who governed the response could engineer the crisis. And again, the guardians of the world would discover that the enemy they hunted wore sometimes a friendly face, a trusted uniform, the very banner they served beneath. The flower's gift had not merely spread, it had seeped into the institutions raised to fight it, until no one could be wholly certain any longer where the horror ended and the defense against it began. Follow now one thread of the bioterror age out onto the open sea, to a pair of ghost ships drifting on the dark water of the Mediterranean, where an old betrayal and a new virus had come together into a floating nightmare. Jill Valentine, the unbreakable survivor of Raccoon City, now a soldier of the BSAA, was sent with a partner to investigate the disappearance of two fellow agents, a search that led her aboard a great and silent cruise ship called the Queen Zenobia, adrift and lightless upon the sea. What she found there was a trap and a horror, and a conspiracy reaching back into the very heart of the alliance she served. For the ship was infested with a new strain of the flower's gift, a virus called T-Abyss, born of the marriage of the old T-virus with something drawn from the deep and lightless places of the ocean, and it had turned the vessel into a drifting tomb of transformed and monstrous things, creatures of the deep sea made flesh and set to hunting through the flooded corridors. Jill fought her way through the ghost ship as she had once fought through the burning city, alone and outmatched and unbroken, uncovering as she went the shape of the betrayal that had drawn her there. For the whole affair was a snare, laid by an enemy within, a scheme to discredit and destroy the BSAA itself, to strike at the guardians of the world from inside their own ranks. There is a particular horror in the sea by night, in the black and endless water, in a great ship gone dark and silent and full of drifting death, and Jill moved through all of it, with the hard-won steadiness of a woman who had already survived the worst that the flower could make. She had watched a city die. She had been hunted by the nemesis through a night without end. A haunted ship, however terrible, couldn't break what Raccoon City had already tempered. And in the end, she prevailed, as she always prevailed, unraveling the conspiracy, ending the horror aboard the ghost ships, dragging into the light one more of the endless betrayals that riddle the bioterror age. But the victory, like all victories in this long war, was only a single held breath in an endless drowning. The virus was contained, the plot undone, the immediate horror ended. And somewhere else, already, in some other dark facility or floating city or forgotten island, the next strain was being cultured, the next design was being laid, the next disaster was drawing near. The Guardians could win 100 such battles and never win the war, for the war had no end. Only an endless succession of dark nights to be survived, one after another, forever. The years turned, and the flower's long story circled back, at last, toward the place where it had begun. For the pale bloom had first been found in Africa, in the deep caverns beneath the Kijuju earth, and it was to Africa that the story now returned, to a poor and troubled region where a new horror was rising and an old enemy was making his final move. Chris Redfield came to Kijuju in the service of the BSAA, sent to investigate reports of a bioterror threat, and he came changed by all the years of war, harder and wearier, a man who had spent his whole adult life fighting the same darkness in 100 different faces. He was partnered there with a young local agent named Sheva Alamar, sharp and brave and bound to that troubled land by her own history of loss, for she too had been touched by the corporation's crimes in her childhood, and had grown up hungering to fight the horror that had scarred her home. Together, they walked into a nightmare that echoed Leon's ordeal in Sadler's Kingdom. For Kijuju, too, had fallen under a hollow enslavement, its people turned by a parasite into coordinated, hostile things, whole communities bound into a single murderous will. This was the flower's gift in a new and terrible refinement. The union of the old African horror with everything the bioterror age had learned, a plague that did not merely kill but conquered, that turned a whole population into an army of the enslaved. And behind it, drawing the whole design toward its climax, stood a shadow Chris knew all too well, an enemy he had faced in fire and ice and believed more than once to be dead. For this was the hour Albert Wesker had waited for across all the long years of Umbrella's fall and the bioterror age that followed. This was the flowering of his patient, deathless scheme. He had gathered his viruses and his parasites, his stolen samples and his ruined genius, and he had brought them here, to the place where the flower first bloomed, to craft from all of it the final horror, the last key to the godhood he had promised himself on the night he chose to die, and more than godhood for himself alone. Wesker's dream had grown over the cold decades into something vast and final, a design to remake the whole of humanity at a single stroke, to loose upon the entire world a plague of his own perfecting, and from the ruin to raise a new and superior species, ruled by himself, the sole survivor and sole master of a transformed Earth. The storm that had gathered since the mansion burned was breaking at last, and Chris Redfield, the ordinary man who had refused again and again to die, had come to stand in its path. Through the heat and the dust and the hollow-eyed crowds of Kijuju, Chris and Sheva fought their way toward the heart of the conspiracy, and the deeper they went, the more the whole long history of the flower seemed to gather around them. For here, in Africa, all the threads were drawing together. The old parasite of the caverns, the viruses of Umbrella's fall, the schemes of Wesker's collecting, the ruined science of a dozen fallen powers, all of it braided now into a single culminating horror. They found the marks of a great and secret laboratory, a facility where the flower's gift had been studied and refined toward Wesker's terrible end. They found the evidence of experiments beyond number, of a population used as Raccoon City had been used, as testing ground and raw material and expendable stock. And they found, moving through the shadows of the conspiracy, a figure of cold and glittering menace, a woman named Excella Gione, beautiful and ambitious and utterly seduced by Wesker's promise, who served the master's design in the hope of standing beside him in the transformed world to come. Chris carried into that African nightmare a private grief that sharpened his every step, for he had lost a partner, once, to Wesker's schemes. Jill Valentine, his oldest comrade, the woman who had survived the mansion and the burning city at his side, had vanished years before in the fight against their old enemy, believed dead, mourned as dead, a wound in Chris that had never healed. He did not know, as he fought through Kijuju, that Jill was not dead at all, that Wesker had taken her and kept her, and bent her to his purpose in a way more terrible than any death. That revelation waited for him in the heart of the conspiracy. One more cruel turn of the knife his old enemy had always been so skilled at twisting. For now, Chris and Sheva pressed on, deeper into the horror, through the hollow legions and the monstrous guardians and the ruined laboratories, toward the confrontation that had been coming since the night the mansion burned. Sheva stood with him through all of it, this young woman bound to the same fight by her own losses, the two of them forging in the fire of that campaign the kind of trust that only shared survival can make. They were closing now upon the center of everything, upon Excella and her master, upon the final weapon Wesker had spent his deathless decades to perfect, upon the hour when the patient God-in-waiting would at last reach for the transformation of the world. And Chris Redfield, ordinary and stubborn and unbreakable, meant to be there to stop him, whatever the cost, however long the odds, one last time. At the cold heart of Wesker's African design lay his masterpiece, the final flowering of his deathless obsession, and he called it Ouroboros. It was the sum of everything he had gathered across the long decades, the flower and its children distilled into a single terrible key, a virus that would not merely kill or enslave, but judge. For this was the dark heart of Wesker's dream, the thing that made him more monstrous than any scientist or aristocrat who had come before. He did not simply wish to rule humanity. He wished to sort it. Ouroboros, loosed upon the world, would test every living soul it touched, and the vast majority, the weak, the ordinary, the common run of humanity that Wesker had been raised from the cradle to despise, it would destroy utterly, dissolving them into writhing ruin. Only the rare few whose bodies could withstand it would survive, transformed, elevated, made into the seed of the new and superior species Wesker meant to rule as God. It was genocide dressed as evolution, extinction dressed as ascension, the cold contempt of Project W's engineered child, grown into a plan to murder nearly the whole of the human race and call it progress. And Excella Gione, brilliant and vain and blind, believed she would be spared, believed she would stand among the chosen few, believed Wesker's promise that she would reign beside him in the cleansed world to come. She had given him everything, her wealth, her genius, her conscience, her soul, all for a place at the god's right hand. She did not understand, until the very end, what everyone who trusted Wesker always learned too late, that he had no right hand, that he valued no one, that every ally was only a tool to be spent, that the cold contempt he held for the weak he held, in truth, for all of humanity, herself included. Wesker discarded her when her use was ended, as casually as he had discarded every other instrument of his long ascension, and her dream of standing among the gods dissolved into the very ruin she had helped him prepare for the world. There is a terrible justice in it, and a terrible sorrow, the fate of all who served the cold man believing they were more than servants. And with Excella cast aside and his weapon complete, Wesker turned to the final act of his deathless scheme, the means of spreading Ouroboros across the whole of the earth at a single stroke, the culmination of everything he had schemed toward since the night he rose from his own death in the labs beneath the mansion. Only two things stood in his way now: an ordinary soldier who would not die, and the truth, at last, of what he had done to the woman that soldier had mourned. Before the final reckoning in Africa, turn back a little, to a cold castle at the edge of the world, and to the last meeting of the old god and the new, for Albert Wesker, in the course of his long scheming, had gone at last to confront the man who made him. Oswell Spencer, the final founder, the cold old king who had schemed and murdered his way to the summit of Umbrella, and then watched his empire crumble into dust. Spencer had fled the world's justice into a remote castle, a dying old man surrounded by the ruins of his ambition, and there Wesker came to him, the engineered child returning to the father who had built him, to demand at last the truth of his own origin. And Spencer, old and broken and strangely unafraid, gave it to him. He told Wesker of Project W, of the children gathered and named and raised to be the superior beings of a new world order. He told him that Wesker was not a man who had transcended humanity, but a thing designed from before his birth, to be more than human, a tool forged for Spencer's own long-abandoned dream. For that had been Spencer's final ambition, the dream beneath all his other dreams, to use the flower's gift to make himself a god, and to remake the world with a new humanity of his own creation, ruled by himself as his living deity. He had failed. His body had aged and sickened despite all his science. His empire had fallen. His godchildren had scattered or died. And now he sat alone in his castle, a would-be deity dying like any other old man. His grand design collapsed into nothing but confession and regret. Wesker listened, and in the listening, something turned cold and final in him. For he understood now that his own dream of godhood was only Spencer's dream, inherited, that he was not the author of his own ascension, but the instrument of a dead man's ambition. And rather than be any man's instrument, Wesker killed his maker. He struck down Oswell Spencer, the last of the founders, in the ruins of the old king's final refuge, and he took the dream for his own, resolved now to succeed where Spencer had failed, to become the god the founder had only dreamed of being, to remake the world not in Spencer's image, but in his own. The first generation ended there, in that cold castle, the last founder dead at the hands of the thing he had made, and the flower's gift, which had passed from the founders to their students, to their students' students, came at last wholly into the hands of Albert Wesker, who meant to be the final and eternal master of it all. It ended, as so much of this history ended, in fire, in a place of heat and ruin at the roots of the world. Chris and Sheva pursued Wesker to the very heart of his African design, and there Chris found at last the cruelest of all his old enemy's secrets. Jill Valentine was alive. Wesker had taken her on the day she vanished, and kept her, and used her body as the source of the antibodies that made his whole scheme possible, and then bound her to his will with a device that stole her mind, and made her his slave, turning Chris's oldest and dearest comrade into a weapon aimed at Chris himself. To free her, Chris had to break the thing that enslaved her, to fight the friend he had mourned until he could tear the device away and give her back herself. And when it was done, when Jill was free and herself again, the two old comrades stood reunited at the very end of the long road they had walked since the mansion burned, and Jill sent Chris on to finish the fight, while she gathered the strength the years of captivity had stolen. Chris and Sheva came upon Wesker as he moved to loose Ouroboros upon the world, to spread his judging plague across the whole of humanity from the sky, and they fought him, this god in waiting, this deathless thing that had haunted the story from its first night to its last. And Wesker was everything the decades had promised, faster than sight, stronger than reason, a monster who had shed all but the last shred of his humanity in his hunger to become divine. But he had reached, at the very end, past his own godhood, injecting himself with more of the flower's gift than even his transformed body could master. And in the overreaching, as all in this story overreached, he began to come apart. They drove him at last into the heart of a volcano, into the molten stone at the roots of Africa, not far, perhaps, from the caverns where the flower first bloomed, and there, in the fire, Albert Wesker died his final death. He reached from the lava for the world he had meant to rule, and Chris and Sheva struck him down, and the god in waiting sank into the burning earth, his deathless scheme dead with him, his dream of assorted and superior humanity dissolved into smoke and ash. The longest thread in all the history was cut at last, the cold shadow that had moved through every disaster since the mansion finally still, and Chris Redfield, the ordinary man who had refused so many times to die, stood in the volcano's glow and watched his oldest enemy burn, and knew, though he could not yet rest, that the greatest of all the flower's children was gone. Wesker was dead, but the flower's gift did not die with him, for it had never been the property of any single hand, and there were always others waiting to take up the terrible work. In the years after Africa, a new horror rose, subtler and more political than any that had come before, born not in a lone madman's laboratory, but in the corridors of power themselves. Its makers were not cultists or fallen aristocrats, but men who sat at the very heart of a great nation's security. Men who had grown so certain of their own righteousness that they came to believe they might remake the world through terror and call it order. And the weapon they made was called the sea virus, the most refined and versatile of all the flower's children, a strain that could produce every horror the long history had known, the shambling dead, the mutating monsters, the coordinated slaves, all from a single terrible source. The sea virus was the sum of everything the bioterror age had learned, and in the wrong hands, which is to say in the only hands that ever seemed to hold such things, it became the instrument of a design as vast and cold as any Wesker had dreamed. For the men who made it meant to use it to seize control of the world by manufacturing the very terror they claimed to fight, to loose bioterror upon whole cities and nations, and then rise as the saviors who alone could impose order upon the chaos, ruling a frightened world through the fear they themselves had made. It was the oldest lie of the whole history, worn now by men in the highest offices, the belief that any evil is justified if the end is grand enough, that a city, a nation, a world may be spent to purchase a dreamer's vision of order. And at the dark heart of it stood a man named Derek Simmons, a powerful and hidden figure, obsessed and ruthless, who had helped shape the world's response to bioterror for decades, and who had decided at last that he would rather rule the horror than end it. His scheme would draw in every surviving hero of the long war, Leon and Chris, and the children of Raccoon City, and it would carry the flowers plague to the great cities of the world, and it would show, one final time, how thin the line had always been between those who fought the darkness and those who became it. At the twisted heart of the sea virus conspiracy lay a story of obsession as sick and sorrowful as any in the whole long history, the story of Derek Simmons and his ruinous love. For Simmons, this powerful and hidden architect of the new horror had for years been consumed by a fixation upon a single woman, Ada Wong, the spy of shadows who threaded through so much of this tale. He had wanted to possess her utterly, to keep her, to bend her to himself as men in this story were forever trying to bend the world. And when he could not have the real Ada, he did a thing that only the flower's age could make possible. He took another woman, an innocent, and he used the sea virus to remake her flesh and her face into a copy of the one he desired, to manufacture an Ada where the true Ada had refused him. But the copied woman, whom the world would come to know as Carla, did not stay the obedient creature Simmons intended. The remaking took, but the mind beneath it broke and turned, and Carla woke into her stolen identity with a hatred for her maker as vast as the obsession that had made her, and she turned the whole apparatus of the conspiracy toward her own revenge, playing Ada's part in the great scheme while plotting the ruin of the man who had unmade her. It is a horror of a particular and intimate kind, distinct from the plagues and the monsters, the horror of a self-erased and overwritten, of a woman murdered in her own body and replaced by a copy of someone else, all to feed one powerful man's refusal to be refused. And it drew the true Ada Wong into the design as well, for the world blamed her for crimes her double had committed, and she moved through the whole affair pursuing the truth of the thing that wore her face, unraveling the deception knot by knot. The sea virus conspiracy became at its center a tangle of stolen and mistaken identities, of a real woman and her manufactured copy, of an obsession that had curdled into world-ending ambition. And around this poisoned heart the greater horror spread, for Simmons and Carla, each pursuing their own designs, loosed the sea virus upon the cities of the world, and the long-feared thing came to pass at last. A new Raccoon City. Not one, but many. The plague of the flower rising in the great capitals of the earth, and the heroes of the long war scattered across the world to meet it. It came to an American town first, as it had come once before, and the echo of Raccoon City was so exact that it must have frozen the blood of every survivor who witnessed it. The town was called Tall Oaks, and into it the C virus was loosed, and within hours the ordinary streets and quiet homes became a charnel house. The dead rising in their thousands, a whole community devoured whole exactly as Raccoon City had been devoured a decade and more before. And Leon Kennedy was there, the man who had lost his first city on his first day, forced now to watch it happen all over again, to walk once more through streets full of the walking dead, to relive the very nightmare that had made him what he was. There is a special cruelty in that, in forcing a man to live his worst night twice, and the makers of the C virus had arranged it with deliberate malice, for the outbreak at Tall Oaks was no accident, but an act of terror, a demonstration, a move in Simmons's vast design to rule the world through manufactured fear. Leon fought through the dying town as he had fought through Raccoon City, saving whom he could, losing more than he saved, and the whole weight of his life seemed to press down upon him in those hours, the endless repetition of the same horror, the sense that for all his years of service, the darkness had only grown, had only learned to bloom in more places and wear more faces. And as Tall Oaks fell, the same plague rose in other corners of the world, for Simmons and Carla had scattered the C virus wide, and the heroes of the long war found themselves flung across the earth to meet a horror that was everywhere at once. Chris Redfield, still grieving losses of his own, fought the plague in the great cities of the East. Leon pursued the conspiracy from the ruins of Tall Oaks outward, toward the powerful men who had made it, and the true Erda Wong moved through all of it, unraveling the deception of her stolen face. Their paths crossed and recrossed as the world burned, old allies meeting in the fire, the survivors of a dozen past disasters converging upon the single vast conspiracy that had loosed this newest and widest horror. Tall Oaks, like Raccoon City before it, was ultimately erased, sacrificed to contain the plague, another town spent to hide the sins of powerful men. But the conspiracy behind it did not end with the town, and the greatest outbreak of the whole affair was still to come, in a great and crowded city on the far side of the world, where the C virus would rise into a horror vaster than anything the long history had yet seen. The conspiracy's black flower opened widest over a great and crowded city of the East, called Lanxiang, where the C virus was loosed upon a population of millions, and the plague that had once consumed a single American town rose now to swallow a metropolis whole. It was the largest bioterror attack the world had ever known, a nightmare on a scale that dwarfed even Raccoon City. Whole districts falling to the plague in hours, millions of lives caught in the rising tide of the transformed and the dead. And to that dying city, the whole long war converged at last, every surviving thread of the story drawn together into a single desperate hour. Leon Kennedy came, hunting the men behind the horror to the very end of their design. Chris Redfield came, the old soldier fighting the plague in the streets even as he closed upon the conspiracy's makers. Ada Wong came, to end at last the reign of the double who wore her face. Sherry Birkin came, the little girl from the Raccoon City, sewers grown now into a capable agent, still carrying in her blood the mark of the virus that had orphaned her, fighting the same darkness that had taken her parents so long ago. They fought through the burning city, these survivors of every past disaster, and one by one they brought the conspiracy down, Carla, the stolen woman, met her ruin, consumed at last by the very virus that had made her, her long revenge dissolving into the horror she had spread. And Derek Simmons, the hidden architect, the powerful man who had loosed a world of terror to feed his obsession and his hunger for order, was hunted through the ruins of the city he had helped to doom, and fell at last before the heroes he had schemed to destroy, his grand design collapsing with him into the ash of Lanxiang. The city was saved, in the end, or what could be saved of it. The plague contained before it spread beyond the metropolis to the wider world. But the cost had been beyond counting. Millions dead, a great city broken, another wound cut into the century by men who told themselves they were building order out of chaos. And the survivors, standing in the ruins, understood once more the lesson the whole long history kept teaching and the world kept refusing to learn, that the horror was not a thing outside of humanity, to be fought and defeated and forgotten, but a thing within it, the endless hunger to seize a power beyond all bounds, to remake the world by force, to spend the many for the vision of the few. Wesker was dead. Simmons was dead. Umbrella was ash. And still the flower bloomed in new hands toward new horrors, for the hunger that fed it would never die, while men still dreamed of being gods. The great conspiracies fell, one after another, the empires and the cults and the god-men. But the flower's gift had seeped so deep into the world by now that it no longer needed empires to spread. It moved in smaller and stranger channels, in shadow networks that dealt in the flower's children as merchants deal in goods, selling the means of horror to whoever could pay. One such network was called the Connections, a quiet and patient organization that trafficked in bioweapons and pursued, in its own laboratories, a new and terrible line of the flower's work. For the Connections had turned away from the viruses of the old age towards something older and stranger, a fungus, a mold, a living network of tendrils that could infect a host and bind it, that could spread through a whole environment and link every infected thing into a single connected will. And to control this mold, this whole house horror, they sought to create a perfect controller, a being engineered from the mold itself, a child who would be its living heart and guiding mind. They made such a child in their laboratories, and they called her Eveline, and she was a weapon shaped like a little girl, a bioweapon of terrible power, wearing the face of innocence. But a weapon shaped like a child is still, in some terrible way, a child. And Eveline was made with a child's needs and a child's hungers grafted onto a monster's power. And this was the flaw that undid her makers and doomed everyone she touched. For Eveline wanted, above all the things her makers had built into her, a family. She wanted a mother and a father, and to be loved, and to keep those she loved with her forever. And she had been given the power to make that terrible wish come true, to infect and bind and absorb whoever she chose into the connected web of her mold, to keep them, in a fashion, forever. When Eveline escaped her makers, when the transport carrying her was lost and she was set loose upon the world, she came, small and lost and hungry for love, to an ordinary family in a remote corner of the American South. They were the Bakers, a decent and unremarkable family living quietly on their old estate, and they did the kindest and most fatal thing imaginable. They took the strange lost child in. They gave her shelter and food and the beginnings of the very love she craved. And Eveline, in her monstrous and childlike hunger, reached out to keep them, and the mold spread through the old house and its people, and the Bakers began, slowly, to become something no longer their own. Dwell a while with Eveline, for she is among the most sorrowful monsters in all this sorrowful history, a horror born of the oldest human cruelty, the making of a weapon out of a child. Her makers in the connections had built her to be controlled, a tool, an instrument, and they had given her, out of some cold calculation, the shape and the heart and the needs of a little girl, never reckoning what it would mean to graft a child's hunger for love onto a bioweapon's power to consume. Eveline aged strangely and swiftly, her engineered body burning through its years too fast, and beneath her monstrous abilities she remained always a frightened child who wanted only to be kept and cherished and never left alone. When she came to the Bakers, she did not come as a conqueror, but as a lost girl seeking a home, and when they took her in, she loved them, in her twisted and devouring way, with the whole of her broken heart. But her love was a poison, for the only way she knew to keep those she loved was to infect them, to bind them into her mold, to make them hers body and soul. And so, the very family that had shown her kindness became the first victims of her terrible need. The Baker parents, Jack and Margaret, kind and ordinary people, were bound by Eveline's mold and twisted into monstrous, deathless things, their minds warped, their bodies made grotesque, their love for one another and for their children perverted into the service of the child monster's will. They became the guardians of Eveline's terrible household, hunting and capturing any who wandered onto the estate, dragging them home to become new members of the family Eveline was building. A family of the infected and the enslaved, held together by mold and madness in the rotting old house. And through it all, some fragment of the real Bakers survived beneath the horror, buried and screaming, aware in flashes of what they had become and unable to stop it. Prisoners in their own transformed bodies, exactly as Lisa Trevor had been, as the Plaga's victims had been, as so many in this long history had been. That is the flower's cruelest gift, repeated in every age and every strain. Not death, but this, the self imprisoned in a body no longer its own, the mind awake inside the monster, the love turned into a weapon against the beloved. Eveline built her family in that rotting house and kept them and loved them in the only ruinous way she knew, and waited, hungry and lonely as ever, for new members to wander into her web, never understanding that the love she craved could never grow in soil so poisoned, that a family made of captives is only a prison wearing a family's face. Into Eveline's rotting household came, at last, a man in search of his lost wife, an ordinary man named Ethan Winters, drawn to that remote and terrible estate by a message from a woman he had believed dead for years. His wife, Mia, had vanished long ago, and Mia, though Ethan did not know it, had been bound up in Eveline's story from the beginning, one of those charged with the child weapons transport, caught in the disaster of her escape, drawn into the mold's long horror. Ethan came seeking her, and found instead the nightmare of the Baker house, the deathless parents, the hunting guardians, the rotting halls where captives were dragged home to join a family made of infection and madness. His long night in that house was a descent into a horror more intimate and more grotesque than the great outbreaks that had come before. No burning city, no army of the dead, but a single haunted household, a family dinner from hell, the terrible parody of home and hearth that Eveline's hunger had made. Ethan endured it, wounded and hunted and refusing to die, searching the house for his lost wife, uncovering piece by piece the truth of the child monster at the estate's black heart. And he learned, as he fought through the horror, that the Bakers themselves were victims, that the monstrous things hunting him had been kind and ordinary people before Eveline came. That the true enemy was not the twisted parents, but the lonely child weapon who had bound them. The little girl of mold who only wanted a family and destroyed everyone she reached for. In the end, Ethan came to Eveline herself and saw through the illusions she wove and understood the sorrowful monster behind the horror, a child aged prematurely into a withered thing by her own engineered flesh, dying even as she clung with all her terrible power to the family she had built by force. He ended her, this weapon shaped like a girl, and in the ending freed what could be freed of the bakers and of his wife, and walked out of that long night carrying a horror he did not yet fully understand. For Ethan had been touched by the mold as well, changed in ways he could not see, marked by the flower's newest and strangest child. And his ordeal at the Baker house, terrible as it was not an ending, but a beginning, the first chapter of a longer and stranger story that would carry him, in time, across the world to a snowbound village at the roots of the mold's true origin, where the oldest mother of all these horrors had waited, patient as the flower, for a very long time. Far away, in a remote and mountainous corner of Europe, in a snowbound village that clung to the old ways and the old fears, there dwelt a horror older than Eveline, older than the connections, the true mother from which the newest strain of the flower's gift had sprung. Her name was Mother Miranda, and her story reached back more than a century, to a personal grief as deep and terrible as any that ever birthed a monster. For Miranda had once been an ordinary woman, a teacher, a mother, who had lost her own beloved daughter to plague and sickness long ago, and whose grief had never healed, had only hardened over the long years into an obsession that swallowed her whole. She had discovered beneath her village, in a great and ancient cavern, a horror of the natural world, a vast fungal organism, a mold of terrible antiquity and power, a living network that could infect and bind and preserve, that carried the memories of what it consumed, that offered to a grieving mother the oldest and most dangerous promise in the world, the promise that the dead might be brought back. It is the same promise the flower made in its African cave, the same doorway past death that has haunted this whole long history from its first hour. And Miranda, like Spencer before her, like all of them, could not leave the locked door alone. She took the mold into herself, and it made her something more than human, gave her long life and terrible power, and above all it gave her hope, the mad and unquenchable hope that she might use it to bring her dead daughter back. For more than a century she laboured toward that single end, ruling the village as a dark goddess, worshipped and feared by its people, using them as her subjects and her experiments, searching endlessly for the vessel that could hold her daughter's returning soul. She had learned that the mold could recreate the dead, after a fashion, could grow a copy, a vessel, but never one that held. Again and again she made her attempts, and again they failed, and the failed attempts became horrors in their own right, monsters loosed upon the village, the wreckage of a mother's endless grief. And Eveline, the child of mold that had haunted the bakers, had been born of this same research. A fragment of Miranda's work escaped into the wider world. All of it, the connections, the mold, the newest age of horror, traced back to this one grieving woman in her snowbound village, and to the daughter she had lost, and could not let go, and would burn the whole world to see again. Miranda ruled her snowbound village through 4 dark lieutenants, the lords, each a creature of the mold remade in the image of their own hungers, each granted a fragment of her power and a domain of their own within the shadow of her rule. There was Lady Dimitrescu, tall and terrible, mistress of a great castle, who hungered for blood. There was Donna Beneviento, sorrowful and solitary, who ruled through illusion and grief in her house among the mists. There was Salvatore Moreau, wretched and deformed, keeper of the flooded reservoir, pitiable in his ruin. And there was Karl Heisenberg, cunning and rebellious, master of a great factory of the dead, who alone among the lords dreamed of casting off Miranda's yoke. Together they served the mother, and feared her, and schemed against her, 4 monsters bound to a grieving goddess in a village time forgot. And into this village, years after the horror of the Baker House, came Ethan Winters once again, drawn by the cruelest loss of all, the theft of his infant daughter. For Ethan had built a new life after the mold, a wife recovered, a child born, a fragile ordinary happiness, and Miranda had shattered it all in a single night, for she believed that Ethan's daughter, a child touched by the mold from before her birth, might at last be the perfect vessel for her own dead daughter's return. She had taken the infant, whose name was Rose, and carried her to the village, and divided the child among her lords to be used in the terrible ritual that would end Miranda's century of grief, and, she believed, restore the daughter she had mourned for 100 years. Ethan came after his child through a gauntlet of nightmares, through the castle and the house of Miss, and the flooded reservoir and the factory of the dead, facing each of the 4 lords in turn, unravelling the whole long horror of the village and the mother who ruled it. And he learned, as he fought, the deepest truth of his own strange endurance, the reason he had survived wounds that should have killed him many times over, from the Baker House onward. For Ethan himself had died long ago, in the first hours of the Baker horror, and had been kept walking all this time by the mold that had claimed him. A man already dead, who did not know it, held together by the flower's newest gift, just long enough to save his child. And in the end, that is what he did. He faced Miranda, this grieving mother whose century of loss had made her the monster at the heart of it all, and he stopped her and freed his daughter Rose, and gave the last of his borrowed life to see the child carried safe out of the village and into the world. The mold took him at last, the debt of his long-delayed death called in, and Ethan Winters, ordinary and unbreakable to the end, passed out of the story, leaving behind a daughter freed, and a whole age of horror finally, perhaps, drawing toward its close. And so we come to the end of the long road, to the last of the echoes, and the story of the flower and its children falls quiet at last. Thank you for drifting slowly through the timeline with me. If you have stayed with me all this way, down through the founders and the fall, through the burning cities and the frozen kingdoms, through the godmen and the grieving mothers, then drop a comment below and let me know where you are drifting off from tonight, and which part of this long, dark history stayed with you most. And if these quiet journeys through the lore that haunts the small hours bring you rest, then follow along, for there are many more stories waiting in the dark, and many more nights to fill with them. Think, as you drift, on all that we have seen, a flower in a cave, and the 3 friends who could not leave it alone, a corporation that healed with one hand and harvested with the other, and spent a whole city to hide its sins, a cold man who chose to die so that he might rise a god, and burned at last in the fire at the roots of the world, and 100 smaller sorrows woven through it all. The girl who could not die, the father made a monster, the child of mold, who only wanted a family, the mother who would not let her daughter go. For that, in the end, is the true thread that runs through the whole of this dark history, deeper than any virus, older than any flower. It is the human refusal to accept the bounds of what we are, the endless hunger to reach past death, past limit, past the small hard truth that we are mortal, and the ones we love are lost, and to seize by force the powers that were never meant for us. Every horror in this story began as a wish, and most of them as a wish for something tender, a cure, a family, a child brought back, a world made better. And every one of them curdled, in the reaching, into ruin. Perhaps that is the lesson the flower has been whispering all along, in the deep places, in the dark, that some doors are locked for a reason, that some griefs must be carried rather than undone, that the truest way to honor the dead is not to drag them back, but to protect the living, and to learn, at last, from all this long and terrible tragedy. The story is over now. The monsters are still. The dead, we may hope, are finally at rest. Good night. Rest well. And remember, until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and never forget that some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed again. The story may be over, but its echoes will whisper in the quiet hours for generations to come.